Yeah, we're working now. Hi.
I call this regular meeting of the City Council of the City of Kenmore to order. Will the clerk please take the roll?
Mayor Baker.
Excused.
Deputy Mayor Van Ness.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Sperry.
Here.
Councilmember Curtis.
Present.
Councilmember Herbig.
Here.
Councilmember Danuski.
Here.
Thank you.
Would you please stand and join me in the flag salute?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. If there are no objections to the agenda, it will stand as approved as submitted. Everybody okay? Next item on the agenda is a Mayor's Day of Concern for the Hungry Proclamation. And I'd like to read that into the record. Whereas our King County cities recognize adequate nutrition as a basic goal for each citizen, and whereas no parent should have to send a child to school hungry, no baby should be without comfort of feedings needed for mental and physical growth, no elderly person's health should be jeopardized by lack of appropriate foods, and whereas food banks, emergency and hot meal programs working with our city's local churches, social service agencies, and hundreds of volunteers are striving day in and day out to stem the rising tide of hunger, but still need more help. And whereas we believe that when citizens who are not involved hear of the especially desperate needs of the hungry as winter approaches and their low incomes must stretch to cover increasing fuel, electricity, and rental costs, leaving even less money for the monthly food purchase, an outpouring of community assistance will follow. And whereas the Emergency Feeding Program of Seattle and King County coordinates an annual food drive to help support efforts of their program and the area's food banks in fighting hunger, which will be held at grocery stores throughout King County on Saturday, September 19th. Now I, therefore, Alan Van Ness, Deputy Mayor, on behalf of David Baker, the Mayor, on behalf of the City Council of the City of Kenmore, Washington, do hereby proclaim September 19th, 2015 as Mayor's Day of Concern for the Hungry in our community. And I strongly urge all citizens to join the Emergency Feeding Program in donating food to our local food banks and at grocery stores this coming Saturday and throughout the year to nourish those who are hungry. Representative from the organization this proclamation is written for isn't here tonight, so we just read it into the record. I'd like to add that last Saturday morning, my wife Barbara and I were over at Food Lifeline. It's a warehouse over in the Shoreline District that takes food from farms and suppliers and farmers in huge quantities and then breaks them down into quantities that the food banks can use. Well, Saturday morning from 9 to 12, we had 50-pound sacks of onions that we sorted through, throwing away the bad ones, the rotten ones. We did 16,500 pounds of onions we sorted through that went down to the warehouse down South Seattle to then to be redistributed out to food banks and other organizations that need the food. So opportunities like that are around year-round to help out with the food banks and feeding the hungry in our community. Next item on the agenda is citizen comments, and this is an opportunity for you to express your views on issues that are important to you and to the community. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes. It's an opportunity for you to address the council. It's not a dialogue between the council and the citizens. So if you have a concern and you're asking a question, somebody from the city will get back to you within a week or two to address the matter. So with that, would you call the first person?
Michelle Murphy.
Yep, please go to the microphone and state your name and address for the record, if you would, please.
My name is Michelle Murphy. My address is 15822 74th Avenue Northeast, Kenmore. And I'm here today to ask the support of 4 council members with regards to amending the City of Kenmore noise ordinance to include the noise that is produced when the game called pickleball is played. I gave each of you last week my statement, and I hope that I have swayed 4 of you to see how the exposure of pickleball interferes with the enjoyment of my property, home, and of my neighborhood. And I can read my statement, but what I want to say today is what saddens me the most is that I have to stand in front of you and ask for your support to amend a noise ordinance so that my neighbors, including Nick Olson, are forced to respect me and the enjoyment of my property environment and the neighborhood I have lived in for 16 years. Prior to Nick Olson moving into the neighborhood, pickleball was never played. And as I know that Nick does not care is when I was told by the chief of the police to talk with my neighbor, and I did. And as I said in my statement, I told Nick that I could hear pickleball noise in my yard, and all he said was, "Really? Pickleball is inherently loud, and that's the appeal of the game." When I answered yes and asked if he and the others he plays could cut down on their playing time, they did not. They still played up to 6 hours on Saturdays and Sundays and up to an hour and a half on weekdays. When I invited him to come into my yard and hear the noise for himself, he did not come into my yard. And the simple act of not coming into my yard proved to me his lack of respect or consideration that he and the others he plays with have for me in the neighborhood. This past Saturday, they started playing pickleball at noon and played till 2 p.m., then started again at 3 and were playing till 4:30 when I left to visit friends. So for 3.5 hours, I was listening to the frequent, repetitive, continuous, precocious noise of pickleball, and I'm 145 feet away. If you Google pickleball noise, you will read that other communities across the country are fighting the noise that comes from pickleball. In one instance, a judge sided with the city because the judge said the neighbors live next to a park, and there is an inherent noise that comes with the park. I do not live next to a park, but Nick and the other players are using the neighborhood as their own personal park. So I thank you for your time, and I hope I have your support.
Patrick O'Brien.
Patrick O'Brien, 6330 Northeast 181st Street. No GMOs, please, in Kenmore. We'll just try to get rid of those right now. But that's not why I'm here. There's some line items dealing with development of Northeast 181st Street. Several council members are in favor of putting sidewalks in and other things that have been deemed necessary on Northeast 181st. And I would just ask that the council better relate the message to the property owners and the people living on Northeast 181st Street, because it seems that since I moved in there, that not only the realignment of the road, but the putting of the library on the south side of 181st Street, and then the necessity of putting a stop sign in has really sent a mixed message as to what we're trying to accomplish in our core. You know, do we want to have the second best bypass to 522 and run that right in front of a pedestrian corridor where people are going to have teriyaki back to the library? So you got to put in a stop sign there, where we need another stop sign, or maybe we need a roundabout, or maybe we need to have a discussion on what the long-term goals of the city are, especially in light that there could very well be the Evergreen Clinic going in, and that I could see where people coming from the clinic might want to go to the library. or people waiting for a relative there. So you're going to have more pedestrian interactions with pretty much a hotbed of traffic, especially from 6 in the morning to 9:30 in the morning, and then from 3 to 6:30 at night. I mean, you can't even pull out of your driveway. It's that congested, and people are trying to make their way over to 61st. Then if you want to put a sidewalk in, I would suggest that you go back and look at 182nd Street again, because the main, excuse me, sorry. There we go. Some of the main roads off of 181st going up the hill are more than a 10% incline, and I've actually seen people slip on a wet day and slide, and fall on that grade. And if you were to put a sidewalk there, it'd have to have stairs, a bunch of other things. Whereas if you came from 182nd Street, there is already a pre-existing staircase right next to where the former Planned Parenthood was. And you could put a bike access in there and have a much more gradual grade and go up into the neighborhood. And when I heard the report and what I understood of that report is that that's Mooney.
Nice to
Sorry. What I understood from that report is that it was geared and biased towards making 181st Street the main corridor for both transit and pedestrians. And I would say it is not in any way the best corridor for pedestrians. I would say it's probably better utilized as a road, at least from 63rd down, well, however you want to do it. But I think there needs to be more of a discussion before you finally get down to where you're going to put the money for the sidewalks and any other type of improvement. Certainly that area got a lot of wind during the last windstorm, and I had a big part of one of my trees come down because it was gusting more than 60 miles an hour. So there are reasons to underground utilities along that street. But I think we're just lacking a little. I know that there's property owners that I've talked to that would love to talk to the city about what the plans are and what makes sense. Thank you.
There's no one else signed up.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mrs. Murphy. We've been talking about this. We've seen the articles about noise in other areas, and it's something that we probably should consider. Mr. O'Brien, thanks for bringing that to our attention. Thanks, Patrick. Next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second. Motion to approve the consent agenda has been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Consent agenda is approved. Next item on the agenda is a transportation impact fee update. Our Public Works Director, Chris Overlease.
Good evening, Deputy Mayor and Council. It's nice to be back in front of you. Again, I'm Chris Overlease, and with me tonight I have Kendra with Fair and Peers and Sarah with Fair and Peers. And we've had Kendra here before. She and her firm, Fair and Peers, were with us all last year as we were updating the transportation element of the comprehensive plan. So tonight's conversation, and I'll turn over to Kendra in just a moment, but tonight's conversation really is a follow-up to all that work last year and the new project list that was created in that plan. So whenever Kendra's ready, we'll let her take it away.
And am I on now? I am. Well, thank you for having me. And just so you know, when I'm presenting, feel free to ask questions throughout. I prefer not to be a talking head, and if you have a question, that actually make things a lot more lively, both for you, me, and the people in the audience, I'm sure. So I'm very excited to be here. Really enjoyed working with the city on getting their transportation element, your transportation element to adoption. But for me, actually, what's really exciting is these implementation items, because this is getting closer and closer and closer to Kenmore achieving its transportation vision. So I'm going to be here tonight to talk about transportation and concurrency. So kind of just few quick items. Here's, kind of the things I'll be talking about. First, it's been a while since I've been in front of you about the transportation element, so I wanted to review some of the key themes that were included as a part of the transportation element. I was going to talk about, first of all, concurrency and impact fees. If you don't work in my office, you're probably not stewing and thinking about those on a daily basis, so I'll just define those terms in really, kind of basic terms here. And then we'll talk about, kind of how do we bridge between the vision and the goals kind of put together in the transportation element and kind of making a concurrency and impact fee program that really helps you to realize and forward those goals. And lastly, we'll talk about, kind of some of our high-level findings and also next steps, because this won't be the last time that I'm in front of you. So first of all, the adopted transportation plan. It was really built around this concept of the layered transportation network. And the layered network is really kind of if you've heard of the concept of complete streets, the layered network is really the next evolution of complete streets. It's a recognition that, it's, when you think about a complete street, the concept's really nice, that, on the street you provide enough space for the vehicles and for the transit and for the pedestrians and for parking and for for bikes. But as you start looking at the right of way that you would need on each and every street to achieve all of those purposes, you realize that that's probably not the most realistic goal for every street. And so really, how we approached complete streets within the transportation element was the idea of a layered network. So recognizing that we want to provide a connected and safe system for pedestrians, for bikes, for transit, for autos and freights, but recognizing that different streets were going to do that in different ways. So really, the big goal, the big picture concept within the transportation element was that we're taking a multimodal approach. So, kind of that first column there on the left, the auto, that's how we've historically thought about transportation. Certainly my profession of transportation planners and engineers for over 50 years, that's really all we thought about. But really, within this element, we were looking through the lens of a bus rider. We were looking through the lens of a kid on a bicycle. We're looking through the lens of someone wanting to walk around Kenmore and enjoy. So kind of how this flows into where we are today, kind of got that on the slide. So the layered transportation network, it kind of sets that expectation that we're going to be providing for all modes of transportation. Kind of what flowed out of that within the transportation element were multimodal level of service standards. So again, now we weren't just thinking about how long is a vehicle waiting at an intersection, but we were thinking about, well, we did consider how long vehicles are waiting to get through Kenmore, but we were also looking at how easy is it to walk through Kenmore, how easy is it to bike, et cetera. So how that gets us to where we are tonight is that multimodal level of service policy within the transportation element, what it set the stage for was a 20-year project list that's very multimodal. And it also set the stage for having a new concurrency system and a new impact fee system. And that's something that throughout the transportation element process, we shared both with you and with the Planning Commission that those were things that we would be revisiting, and that's what I'm here tonight to introduce. So here's your previous level of service policy. Actually, this is no longer, kind of what we're planning around since the new transportation elements in place. But in the past, really just looked at intersections and how long a car was waiting at those intersections. And what that led to, and this slide here kind of shows you have an impact fee program on the books today. So impact fees are not a new concept within Kenmore. But your current impact fee program is built around your old level of service policy, with an old level of service policy being all around kind of vehicle experience and vehicle delay. The resulting projects that could be funded by that impact fee program are just auto benefiting projects. So they're roadway expansions, they're signal improvements. What this new program and what we're going to be proposing tonight and talking to you and getting your feedback about is a new impact fee program that kind of looks at your new level of service policy, which is multimodal, and it funds a much more robust list of projects. So we still have those auto projects. There are some auto projects in there. There are some intersection improvement projects. But on top of that, we're able to fund transit improvements and bicycle improvements and walking improvements. So concurrency is a concept here that the impact fee really kind of ties hand in glove with. Concurrency, it sounds like, you know, maybe a complicated topic, but it's really not. All that concurrency says is that as you're developing as a city, as you bring in more development, you need to be building your transportation system concurrent with that development. So it's a very simple kind of check and balance that the Growth Management Act has put out there. And really, the Growth Management Act, what it asks is that you're building facilities such that you're maintaining your level of service standard over time. So again, for many communities, including Kenmore currently, auto delay has been the traditional metric. In this new program, since we have a multimodal level of service policy, we'll have more multimodal metrics. So impact fees, again, this is not a new concept for you, so I'll go quickly. These are one-time charges paid by new development. They can only fund projects that add capacity to help with growth. So with impact fees, we really can't fund existing deficiencies. If you have an intersection that isn't operating today, we can't fund fixing today's problem. That's not to say we can't fund the project, but we actually have to subtract the portion of that project that's addressing an existing deficiency. You also can't fund maintenance projects with impact fees. So there are some parameters around the types of projects that you can fund within your program. More and more communities are choosing to fund non-motorized projects, so projects for walking and biking as a part of their transportation impact fees, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Your current impact fee is about $7,300 or $7,300 per PM peak hour vehicle trip. So the first thing that when we're developing an impact fee program is we look at what are those potential projects that you have on the books that could be funded by impact fees. And so what we did is we went back to the transportation element and we looked through all of those investments that would be okay to fund within the parameters of the Growth Management Act. And so you can see here we've got about $114 million worth of projects. What I would say is that we don't have to pick every single one of these projects. We can craft the impact fee program around any kind of grouping of eligible projects that you think is appropriate.
I do have a question.
Absolutely.
So when I look at the dollar amount, I'm guessing we're not getting the bridge for $8 million. So can you, when you kind of get to that point, where did those particular numbers come from?
Absolutely. That's a good question. So for the West Sammamish River Bridge, we had to deduct the outside source of funding that you're getting. So I believe you've got a $12 million BRAC grant for that. And so we can't include that. So actually we probably would have been better if we'd actually shown that, but yes.
So just to be clear, so at this point what you're really showing is city money exclusive of other sources for each of these projects. So this is sort of the big picture, not necessarily what could be possibly funded by transportation fees?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Question on the yellow standards for pedestrian and bicycle. I haven't heard that term before.
That's a carryover from the transportation element. So we talked about different things within the transportation element. What we did with city staff is and the Planning Commission, we looked at, we set kind of a green, yellow, and red standard for pedestrian facilities. And essentially, green standard were all of the sidewalks that it would be ideal to provide over time in Kenmore. And we crunched the numbers for those, and I think actually there was some city engineering documents to look at as well for that. And it was much more than would be financially feasible to include. So then we looked at a scaled back list of really much more high priority sidewalks. So it was making sure that you've got sidewalks on at least one side of the street, the most important areas, but providing more heavy sidewalk coverage around schools, parks, and heavy pedestrian generators. And that was the yellow standard.
Thank you.
I had a question about the Sammamish River Bridge. Is there going to be an increased capacity with just replacing the bridge?
So
Isn't that what we're financing with impact fees?
So that's a very good question as well, because if you think about, from a vehicle lane perspective, we're not actually adding new lanes with the bridge. However, there is a much more gracious bicycle and pedestrian facility that's going to be provided, I believe, on the west side of the bridge. And because of that, we're able to make the argument that it's adding capacity.
And we took this list from the transportation element, and there's $8 million in the state transportation package for the bridge. So I think there's a couple of projects on this list that we just wanted to show the list and what the dollar value was. And another one that we wanted to bring to your attention was the very bottom project, which is a Lake Point Drive West. We really struggled in the transportation element last year, had to show potential Lake Point Drive, and we weren't sure, still aren't sure what's going to happen there. So at that point in time, we chose to estimate what maybe the city's contribution could be to growth long term. So I think these are two projects that, on this list that we've identified, and the bridge too, is we might not want to include those on our project list. Now, Kendra, I'm learning a lot about impact fees myself, and she said of that $114 million, those are the project costs that we think are eligible, but it's not all of that total project cost, it's growth.
Correct.
So, so it's a much, and she'll get into this math in a minute, but it's a much lower number that the impact fee is actually based on. Because one of the tenets of impact fees is that if it's on this list and we're charging impact fees, if a developer should come in and build that facility, they get credit for their impact fees. And so we have to look at all of these projects on the list, and we're not going to ask you to choose a final number or approve anything tonight. It's all to kind of remind us of where we've been and what the project list is looking like. We might want to take a couple of these projects off or look at them again before we actually finalize our numbers. So the numbers we'll show you tonight include these costs. And so if we take these projects out, the cost would go down, not the full dollar value, but a piece of it that's growth related.
Any other questions on the project list?
Actually, I have one. So who makes the final decision then on what qualifies for this list?
I think you do.
We do. Okay, that's what I just want to make sure. So you just give us the information as a recommendation based on what your judgment is, and then we have to just approve that?
So we'll take your feedback tonight and we'll revisit the project list, and if there's any readjusting of the numbers, we'll do that. And then when we come back again, we'll show you what the new numbers look like, or we can get that information to you in the interim. But given the numbers we're going to show you tonight include those projects, if we take anything out, the number would go down.
Does it go out in a proportion to the proportion that project is in this total?
In a way, yes. I would suggest we get into Kendra's math and we can discuss how.
Okay, thank you.
Portion of a proportion.
Yes, thank you.
It depends. Anything else? Should I go? Okay, I think that covered it pretty well. So here's my math, and actually with no numbers. So I thought it would be good to just talk about the concept of how we calculate impact fees. So first we start with the eligible list of projects. So the previous slide kind of showed our scan of the transportation element and what could potentially be eligible. And certainly that doesn't mean that's going to be what we have, but that's what you start with. Then what you have to do is look at those projects and say, some of these projects are addressing an existing deficiency, and that could be a level of service issue. Currently, if something isn't meeting, your vehicular delay standard, we also looked at it from a bicycle and pedestrian standpoint. So we looked at, which of these projects are addressing an existing challenge or existing deficiency, and which of these are providing, are addressing future growth. And so we did some math, and first we stripped out that. The next kind of question that we say is that for impact fees, the whole point of impact fees is to support future city growth. So we used the travel model, and we looked at, what, portion of kind of trips on Kenmore's transportation system is emanating from growth within Kenmore, and what portion is maybe just passing through the city, or some of those trips start in Kenmore and end somewhere else, or start somewhere else and end in Kenmore. So we had to kind of do some math to kind of figure out then what is the ending portion of that growth that could really that project list that we can really say is not addressing existing deficiencies and is accommodating future growth within Kenmore. And so we get that dollar total, and then we divide it by something called a mobility unit to get a cost per trip. So I think the first kind of question you guys probably have is, what's a mobility unit? So mobility units, really something that was really important when we first met with Chris. She impressed upon us that her future vision for kind of Kenmore is that we're looking at things more holistically. We're not just looking at vehicle capacity and building a system that's all around carrying vehicle trips, but we're recognizing the diversity of trips that you have within your system. People get to work or get to school or get to where they want to shop by transit. Sometimes they drive by themselves. Sometimes they drive in a carpool. Sometimes they walk, and sometimes they take a bicycle. So what we did was instead of looking just at the number of cars within the system, what we looked at is the number of person trips within your system. And it's really those person trips that are a mobility unit. So for your new system, what we did was we figured out of those eligible projects, so we went through that math, and we figured out what is that ending kind of total. And we divided that by the number of mobility units within your system. And so kind of in this proposed system as we have it structured right now, and again, this is just getting you guys familiar with concepts, not necessarily recommending a rate tonight, but it would be $6,500 per PM peak hour person trip or per mobility unit. This is an upper bound. So, and I'm going to talk on the next slide about how this compares with your existing program. But what we do within a rate study, which is what we're developing for the city, is we show you this is the upper limit of what you could be charging. City council, such as yourself, can actually choose to charge something lower. So what we're really giving you is kind of that upper level. The benefit of this, and I'm going to talk about kind of how the system compares with what you have today, is that it can fund a much more multimodal list of projects. So again, to go back to that slide where I showed today, you can fund intersection improvements and extra lanes on the road. What we can fund is that kind of list of projects we had there, which included sidewalk improvements, included bike improvements, included a big diversity of projects. Okay. So here's kind of how it boils down. And again, this is just the math with that kind of potential list of projects that we showed. So to compare, we took a few land uses and we said, the current impact fee per single family household right now is about $8,000. With this potential program, as we're looking at it right now, it could be $10,000 per dwelling unit. So that goes up. You can see there's also an increase on apartment units, but if you look at shopping center uses, those are actually going down per square foot. So the math is a little bit different. It's roughly in the same neighborhood of what you're charging today. So mostly what we're here tonight is to really get kind of your guys' feedback, initial reactions, so that we can kind of go back and refine kind of our recommendations for you. We will at some point be coming back with kind of some code amendments related to your current level of service policy and getting that up to scratch with what's in the transportation element, and also to update your impact fee. But that's certainly not something that's imminent. We're more interested in hearing what you guys have to say. So that's all I have.
Questions now? Ready for
Sure.
discussion?
Absolutely.
Councilmember Curtis?
It seems like when we did this before, we were at the upper range of normal or the neighbors for what we were charging. But some of the thought was, well, the others just hadn't caught up. They hadn't gotten around to doing their impact studies, and once that all happened, everybody else would probably go up as well. So before we look at what we're going to do going forward, how does our baseline compare to what other people are doing?
That's a very interesting question. As you know, there have been a number of, all the communities around here have been updating their transportation elements, and just completed in 2015. So a number of communities are now looking at updating their impact fees. So Kirkland is in the process of updating its impact fee right now. North Bend, Mercer Island, actually, we've been talking with all of those communities. Sammamish, as you know, currently the highest impact fee in the state is Sammamish, which is right in the $15,000 to $16,000 per single family dwelling unit. As we kind of showed you the example that we have tonight, at $10,000 per dwelling unit, you would definitely be on the upper end as of right now, although a number of communities are starting to creep up. So snapshot in time today, you would be higher than most communities, as you are currently. But, if we were to look out 2 or 3 years from now, it's hard for me to say, as a number of communities are revisiting what their impact fees will be.
All right, thank you.
And I would add, though, that there are communities that have impact fees now that haven't had them before. So I guess it seems to me through conversations in our industry that more people overall have impact fees. So you have a lot that went from 0 to maybe less than ours, but I think not having an impact fee is not as common.
Councilmember Smith?
Thanks. I had the exact same question, so I've got it answered. Thank you.
Councilmember Herbig?
I just wanted to say on first read through, I'm really supportive of changing how we do this. This is a more holistic approach that I think better reflects us as a community, and I'm a firm believer in growth paying for growth, and this is a good step in actually making sure the growth is paying for all the growth, not just the cars going around through the city. So I'm supportive. Thank you.
Councilmember Danuski?
I also like the new method. We are pretty high, so I do want us to look at our project list and take off things that are funded and things that don't quite fit, and make sure we have the right list if we're going to be that high, especially since we just did that section of Kenmore where we waived the impact fees. So this is a little bit contradictory if we're going to be raising it. So just so make sure we understand all of that.
There were only a few of us, Councilmember Curtis and Councilmember Sperry, that were here when we went through this the last time. That must have been a good 5 years ago. And as I recall, we were going through the whole 20-year transportation improvement program, a TIP, whatever that stands for. And we had to fund things that were on that list from either expected grants or gas tax, whatever. And then we had to make up the difference with impact fees. And so in order to pay for everything we wanted to do, the impact fees wound up being pretty high. And I remember the consultant at the time saying, it's a two-edged sword. You can either discourage development with high impact fees, or developers may look at the high impact fees and say, hey, this community is investing in itself. They're investing in the transportation. This is a community we want to build in. And in the last few years, we've had a lot of development going on in the city of Kenmore, a lot of single-family housing being built. I think, it's been high, yes, but I don't think it's been so high that it's discouraged new construction in the city of Kenmore. So whether we go any higher or not, I don't know, but I like the idea of funding with impact fees, things other than cars and roads, that all types of transportation are worth investing in, and new people coming into the city are going to be using all forms of transportation. So it does make sense to broaden the use of impact fees. Councilmember Sperry, you had your hand up.
Well, Deputy Mayor, you did such a good job of explaining all that. I don't know that I need to add much other than I'm really pleased to be getting beyond our whole discussion on level of service previously was how long do you want to wait at the intersection? And I think that to have a model and a way to really think about moving people and recognizing, as you said earlier, people are going to be walking, biking, perhaps taking transit, driving a car, carpooling, whatever. And how do we address that? The only thing I would add is I did go through the pain of possibly thinking we were going to be the highest city with impact fees a number of years ago, and I got through that, and it was okay. And we are very unique in that we are poised for growth. I mean, no one has a Lake Point property. We're seeing across the street. And so I absolutely agree that we need to look at ways to pay for this. I mean, it's millions and millions of dollars of improvements that need to be made. And so I would support going forward with this process.
Any other questions? Dr. Curtis?
Just a last comment. I remember how agonizing discussions of level of service and every corner and every direction, it was bad. So you did a really great job of explaining this in ways that actually really made sense to a non-engineer. So thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Yes.
So we're not asking you to vote on this tonight, but we would like some general direction so that we can have an idea of what to come back to you with. And in particular, the rate. You basically have three options: go higher, stay the same, or go lower. My recommendation is to stay the same. Couple reasons. One is our financial projections and our 6-year CIP are based on a certain income stream coming from impact fees, and if you lower them, we might have to lower that revenue source as well, and then that would affect our CIP. That's the main reason why I'm recommending that you keep them the same. But also, we aren't seeing the development community running away from Kenmore because of our impact fees. In fact, next month, Brian Hampson is going to give you a report on where we're at with development activity, and it's exceeding what we anticipated, and that's an understatement. So I'm kind of stealing his thunder for a month from now, but the development community is not staying away from Kenmore because of our impact fees. So my recommendation is to keep them the same. If you want to go higher, you can, but we are also kind of on the upper end compared to other cities, so my recommendation is to stay where you are, but again, you can do whatever you want.
Councilmember Curtis? No, Herbie first. Didn't see you.
Well, I'll just wait out there and say that I would personally be fine with going a little bit higher because, like I said, I think growth should be paying for growth, and we shouldn't be asking our current residents to pay for facilities that new development brings to us. So I'm fine with us going a little higher if it means that we are able to actually pay for these things.
Councilmember Curtis?
And my concept would be, I'm sort of a math guy. So I like sticking with facts instead of just randomly saying, well, we have all our facts, so let's decrease it 25%. That just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So as much as now, I think we should clean up the list, take off things that we think don't belong there, and that will bring the number down some proportion. But to just randomly decrease it to what we're doing now doesn't make sense to me.
Councilmember Sperry?
Well, thank you. I think I would like to have more more of a discussion, looking at on the impact fees, looking at projects, looking at what does that look like if we adopted something like that, and some projections. I guess I'm saying I need numbers to see what our options are. I guess I would like options. Yes.
I don't want to go any lower, but I don't necessarily want to go to the high level that you've set there. But if you can justify, or if we can justify a higher impact fee, that the citizens are going to get this for the current level, and we can give you this much more if we go higher. And if we can justify that it's worth the investment, then I'd be willing to increase it some. I don't necessarily want to be the highest in the community. That would be a challenge to beat some Amish, I guess, but but I don't think we need to increase it to. I mean, your 10,000 is pretty high. But if we need to go to 8,500, 9,000 for a home, and we can justify that in terms of what it's going to do for the city, then I'd be in favor of that. So I know that's what Representative Councilmember Smith.
Representative Smith, wow.
Yeah.
I would, kind of like Councilmember Curtis, I like the fact it's based on, this, although I don't, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you get to some of these places with these numbers, but I would rather have it based on something than just us arbitrarily coming up with what we think is the right spot. I also don't have a problem if it is going to be a little bit higher that that's what it is. But I do have one question that I don't know how much of an impact it has when you're running your calculations, but it had to do with understanding the drive-through growth and what gets qualified. And if you don't mind, could you give me the really quick version, if that exists, of how that is determined, what percent is drive-through and what percent is within the city?
A man after my own heart. So I won't bore the rest of you with this too much. All of the numbers and kind of how we calculate, so that goes to the land use. So the question in terms of the impact fee, so for the impact fee we got to what is the cost per mobility unit. So the real question is how many kind of mobility units is each land use generating? And kind of the question that you've asked is kind of drive-through, or sometimes in engineering terms we call them pass-by trips. So how many net new mobility units is this unit or is this use generating? So I'll give you an example of two uses and we can talk about them. One is a fast food restaurant like McDonald's, and the other is a super yummy sit-down restaurant. Well, most of the trips that are coming to the super yummy sit-down restaurant, while it's not as many trips as McDonald's, people are leaving and they're going out for that explicit purpose. So the trips that are being generated by the super yummy sit-down restaurant are all new trips. And so there's no real reduction there. We recognize that all of these trips that are coming in, they're being generated by this restaurant. Whereas the other example, McDonald's, most people don't go, oh man, I got to get out and I got to get to McDonald's. McDonald's, you go to that because you happen to be passing by. It's there, you're hungry, McNuggets don't sound too bad, and so you end up going there. And so we do provide, a fair reduction for uses that are associated with high amounts of pass-by. And so we did Starbucks as a use like that. Most people don't have a destination Starbucks. Starbucks often just kind of, we call it intercepts trips that are already occurring. People are already driving from A to B. Starbucks is on the way. They're not really going on that street because of Starbucks. And so we do take that into consideration.
Thank you.
Councilmember Curtis.
It seems like when we've done some developments, particularly like across the street, we forgive some fees. And I can't remember, are impact fees one of those things we can forgive, not forgive? If we forgive it, we have to pay it out of our own pocket. Remind me.
Technically, with impact fees, that if the city chooses to forgive them, the city, in theory, should be covering those impact fees. So that's very typical. It's very common throughout Washington State for communities to forgive affordable housing their impact fees. And so, but typically there is a mechanism that when those impact fees are being forgiven, that there is an explicit kind of mechanism that the city is putting money into the impact fee account from other city sources.
Thank you.
So affordable housing is the one exception. A law, I think, passed by the state legislature in 2011, I believe, or 2012, allows cities to exempt impact fees for affordable housing without requiring the city to pay itself back. But it is true for all other impact fee exemptions. If you exempt the fee, then you have to come up with the money out of the city's pocket.
Is the timing of payment of the impact fees variable, like at the time of permit versus time of occupancy? Can that be changed to encourage development?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't, Rob, if
The answer is
you know,
yes.
Yes, so the answer is yes. Okay.
Yes? Okay.
As long as the fees are paid before the impact occurs.
Your microphone on?
I heard certificate, isn't it on?
It's on.
I heard certificate of occupancy. To me, that's a reasonable last point where the payment can be made, because the certificate of occupancy means that the trips will start immediately. But before the certificate of occupancy, there's a lot of leeway in the statute as to when the fees need to be paid. They could be paid all at once, they could be paid in increments. You have a lot of leeway.
So we were collecting them at building permit issuance, but state law just recently changed and now delays the payment of them to certificate of occupancy. Right, Brian? Yeah.
Okay.
We did have Main Street agree to pay them sooner, though, in the development agreement.
Okay. Councilmember Smith.
I have one more question, and is this because with like Lake Point on such a multi-million-dollar project, and there would be considerable traffic impact fees, is everything in this process and the way we select our projects, is that fully defensible if somebody were to challenge it? Which, if it's a hundreds of millions of dollar project, I would think they're going to look at it differently.
That's a very good question. You are allowed to put any eligible project within your impact fees. So to the extent that you've got a project that isn't eligible for impact fees, you were funding maintenance or existing deficiencies with your impact fees, then that would be challengeable, of course. But to the extent that you have an impact fee program and you've selected eligible projects that meet, kind of what the GMA says is okay, and you're charging those impact fees based on a defensible mechanism in terms of their impacts, then that should withstand any suit.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions or comments? Councilmember Sperry.
Thank you. My question is really more of a process timing question. So is this something that in order to have impact, say, for 2016 on, then we have to have it all done by the end of the year, or do we have some leeway? I guess what I'm asking is that how comp plan amendments, we have to always have them done by that December 31st deadline. Is that fit in this category? I know it's more development, or is this something that we could keep working on?
I think we would like to, I don't think there's any rule that it has to be done at a certain time. I think our goal is to, now that, we're back in session and meeting regularly, that we would like to talk to you about this. We'll come back soon with the amendments that Kendra mentioned. So our intent was to have this wrapped up this year, but it wasn't because of any driving deadline.
Okay. Are we limited as to how often we can revisit this?
Well, because it's tied to the project list and the transportation element, I think we would have to open up the transportation element and modify the project list.
And then out of that, this aspect could be developed. Okay. And really the reason I'm asking that is that we have areas that may change, and I just wanted to make sure we have a way to capture that.
It's actually very common for communities to update their impact fees every 2 to 5 years. So to the extent that a major project comes on and you decide that it's worthwhile to be on your TIP, which is your 6-year transportation improvement program, it's perfectly acceptable for you to add that in.
So we're not locked into a certain amount of time or anything. Thank you.
That's correct.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, I could answer Councilmember Sparrow's question.
Go ahead.
Impact fee regulations are development regulations under the Growth Management Act. As development regulations, the Growth Management Act does not restrict the number of times a year that a council can amend impact fees, and it also does not require that the council wait a certain period of time, such as for comp plan amendments, before passing amendments to the impact fees. So the bottom line is that the council can consider the impact fees at any time during the year. It doesn't have to consider it this year, and you can revisit impact fees at any time you want.
Okay, so if there are no further questions or comments, the staff wants some recommendation as to how they proceed, and as I understand it, well, there are 4 choices that look to lower the impact fees, keep them the same, accept a little increase in fee, or some increase, or go to the maximum as has been proposed. If we could have a show of hands.
Deputy Mayor?
Further comments? Yes.
I guess I feel like I'm not ready to say I want to go here or there specifically on the impact fees until we have some more information. So I guess my personal, I didn't really hear anybody say lower them, so I don't think that's really on the table. Right. But I think really before people decide, the same or how much to increase, what I was hearing was we'd like some more information and have that discussion and make that recommendation later rather than now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was thinking the same way. The city manager?
Yeah, what we could do is make the adjustments to the project list and then come back to you with a project-based recommendation that will be likely a little bit higher than the current impact fee. At least the same, but maybe a little higher.
Okay. That makes sense to me. The main thrust here is not necessarily to set the impact fee, but to also change the use of impact fees. And I think that's important. I think we all are on board with that. But how much, if we're going to add the multimodal projects to the road projects, either we got to cut the road projects or we've got to increase the impact fees. So I think the sense here is if you could come back to us with a proposal that justifies an increase in fees to some degree, your recommendations, and then we'll act on it at a future meeting. When is this due to come back to us?
I think in the next month or 2, this fall.
Okay. Is that reasonable?
It is.
Does that give you enough
you.
direction?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
You okay with that, everybody?
Sounds great.
Thumbs up? Okay.
And I do have one more question.
Sure.
That it has to do with the single-family residential versus the commercial component here. I think it's pretty obvious the residential market has experienced considerable appreciation, so it's a lot easier for the developers of commercial or of residential properties now to absorb in the marketplace an increase in fee. And I'm just wondering, are the two always tied together simultaneously, since we haven't seen nearly the growth rate in appreciation in the commercial aspect? So an increase in impact fees on the commercial thing when we're trying to get, like restaurants to come and open, it is a significant barrier, and probably a much more significant barrier than it is on the residential development side. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand the question, and
Okay.
I've heard it before. So typically we do base it on a single metric, which in this case is a mobility unit, which puts everyone in pretty equal footing. It would not be unheard of. There are communities out there that have elected to, for certain uses, reduce rates because they feel like that's a community benefit. To the extent that you're putting different uses at different rates, that can kind of create a feeling of inequity. So that's something that is really a policy decision for you as a city council.
Okay. Thank you. I would actually, and I haven't talked to anybody else about it, but I would be interested in knowing more about that, because you could make a reasonable argument that if you had more commercial opportunities here for local residents for retail and services, that it actually could decrease the amount of travel time necessary.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Okay, well, thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is road standards and policy discussion number 2, an encore from a few weeks ago. And Chris Overlease is still on board, on deck here.
That's right.
And Zach Richardson will be joining her.
So we'll let Zach come on up and swap out presentations.
So you may recall that we were scheduled to talk about this at the last City Council meeting of the summer, July 27th. But Zach just didn't seem to show up that day, and we were just kind of left hanging.
We want to see a picture.
Yeah. So it sounds like you guys had quite a meeting, but I was busy dealing with the birth of my first child, so that was a fun day.
Right.
So we elected to punt this until today. So
Yes.
We
And,
were all happy that night, I'm sure.
And you learned a valuable lesson about babies doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, we had everything was planned nicely for Tuesday, and she decided to show up on Monday anyways. So she has a mind of her own already. So yeah, as Rob mentioned, I'm Zach Richardson, one of the project managers here, and tasked with getting the road standards finalized, and Chris is up here with me as well. So this is the second round of discussions we had. I don't know if you guys remember way back in July, we did talk through about 5 different points. 4 of them we kind of got closed. One of them was left open to kind of revisit tonight. So tonight we're coming back to you with 3 different policy discussions plus the one that we're revisiting from last time. So we got through frontage improvements, frontage definition on flag lots, sidewalks, and utility undergrounding last time. And this time we're going to look at our residential road widths and if we want to provide on-street parking in those locations. And then that'll be kind of coupled with the amenity zone discussion that we punted from last time. And then we'll also be talking about if we want to keep this half-street standard, which I'll explain further, and then where do we want to do downtown improvements within this downtown corridor. So yeah, we're working through the road standards now. We had obviously a bit of a delay in not getting this part done in July, so we're still working through it. But we're looking, after this meeting, I'll go back and be working through the final revisions and updating the KMC language to account for the adoption of the new standards. And we'll bring that back to you. And I think right now we're scheduled for mid to late October to bring the final draft to you guys so you can see everything. And then we'll have to go through the Department of Commerce and SEPA review before we do a final adoption of that. The policy is generally laid out where we're going to talk about the proposed standard, the existing standard, what the impacts are between those 2 changes, what our current staff recommendation is, and then I will ask for your input. We did modify today's so that we're going to talk about the residential road widths and parking issue and the amenity zone together before we ask for your opinion. We felt that those are kind of building blocks into the roadway that need to be discussed as one to some degree. So, and then I just wanted to remind everyone, we're talking tonight about non-arterial streets. All the arterial streets have their own cross sections based on that layered network that Kendra was talking about. So those are very specifically done in line with that transportation element. So these are just your residential and smaller commercial roads, just much smaller scale than those. So the first issue to talk about today is the residential roadway widths and the on-street parking. Currently, we are proposing to use 2 different types of residential roads. One would be for 50 lots or less, and the other would be for 50 lots or more than 50 lots, excuse me, at 24 feet of pavement for the smaller road type and 34 feet of pavement for the larger road type. Compared to the old standard, we're simplifying what used to be 4 different road types. It went 1 to 16, 16 to 50, 50 and 100, and then 100 and over. So we've just narrowed that down to 2 types, plus or minus 50. And I'll show you in a second how those are all different and what's changed. The other thing that's worth discussing, these are items we're not actually proposing to change currently. They live in a separate section of KMC, but in that separate section, we do actually require that each single-family home provides space, either in a garage, a carport, or a paved area for 2 vehicles. So there is on-site parking. And in addition to that, we actually require that that space be set back 20 feet from the right-of-way line. So 2 spaces are actually supposed to be for parking, but then with the additional 20 feet, you've essentially put 4 cars availability on that site, on that single-family home. And so that's already in the KMC. Again, we're not proposing to change that tonight. It's just relevant in the conversation of, do we want to provide on-street parking? So with our smaller roadway width, this is essentially what it would look like as staff is proposing it. You'll see that we have sidewalk on both sides. There's an amenity zone on both sides as well. And in this, we're showing a 24-foot travel way for our smaller residential roads. Now, this can be configured in several different ways, 2 of which I'm showing here. If we had parked vehicles on both sides, we would still maintain about 10 feet clear, so 1 vehicle at a time could pass through there. That's pretty similar to what you'd see in a lot more urban neighborhoods. Seattle's got tons of these where you can't pass with more than 1 vehicle at a time. So again, this roadway, as it's shown here, would be limited to 50 lots or less. So not tons of cars that need to use this access. So we're proposing this 24-foot width because we think that this does allow for on-street parking, as shown in the top figure there. The discussion, part of the question for you is, do we need to feel responsible to provide that or not? That's kind of what we're asking your opinion on. The larger residential road would look something more like this. It's a wide roadway. It gives us a lot of ability to change it as it develops, because again, these will be residential roads that are over 50 lots, so as they develop, they may change. We've maintained 2 lanes of travel, even if we have cars parked on either side, or if we want to eliminate the parking, we can get turn lanes in. We can also get in buffered bike lanes. You don't typically see bike lanes on residential roadways this small, but we do have the ability to do it with these widths.
So Zach, since we look at these every day, could you quickly walk through each of these diagrams and quickly point out kind of what you're seeing? Would that be helpful?
You guys understanding the photo, or okay? Hopefully, yeah. It's in the packet as well, so I'm hoping you guys have seen these. But yeah, it's just to show some different configurations that we could do. The bottom one is obviously if it's completely unencumbered, we have a nice open 2 lanes and a turn lane or a center divider, or obviously we can tweak it. So this table is just showing the different.
Excuse me, Zach.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Could you go back to that one slide?
Yeah.
Thank you. So these are more than 50 lots. Mm-hmm. So a new development of some scale would be this way. I notice on your top example roadway, you've got fog line outside the where the parking would be. So, obviously we want slow traffic. So is that part of the proposal, even if it was a bigger street, that it would be striped narrower?
That's a very good question. I actually forgot to mention that. Thank you. As we're proposing it, this would require the fog lines to be striped in that location, unless we were going to do some sort of alternative, like with the bottom 2, where we're actually going to stripe in something. Without the cars actually physically parked there, we would have the fog line striped at that location. It's part of that road diet, narrowing it up to slow them down, that concept. So yes, very good catch.
I see it every day at my street, because we have a lot of multifamily at the end of our street, and then at the other end is a school. And so we're now at the Seattle level, where you sort of wonder where the other car is going to go so that you can go past. We can barely do it, but if you get too far over But you know what? The speeds are so much lower than they used to be. So I do see the example of that working. So
It's easy to look at it when it has the two cars shown like in the figure, but once they disappear, that's going to start feeling like a large roadway. So yeah, we definitely wanted to make that fog line part of that requirement for that roadway. On the smaller one, we weren't proposing the fog line requirement. We could, but because the 24 to 20 feet is just 2 feet on either side, it seems a little less useful there, but we certainly could.
Thank you.
Zach, are we talking about regulations for new roadways, for new developments?
Correct. This would be new roadways.
Okay.
So
this is also neighborhoods. There's these regulations, these codes don't apply to them.
In situations where half of the roadway had developed, we would probably we would apply the new standards most likely to the other half when it developed. So there are potential where you're working with some existing roadway, but they're going to be improving their half of the roadway at least. And again, these aren't the arterials. These are your smaller ones where there's probably already driveways coming off of that roadway.
As Councilmember Sperry said, the roads down in Seattle, being parking on both sides and room for one car to pass, it is a very effective speed control device. You just don't go fast on those roads. And it might be nice in our neighborhoods, single-family neighborhoods, to encourage that sort of thing.
Yeah. So that was part of the first conversation we had back in July, was talking about how these would apply to different situations. So these are only going to apply to development projects. So you're not going to go back and retrofit things that are already existing, but where they're developing a new property or on the far side or at the end, we would possibly, depending on how the transitions work out, it may not make sense to do it sometimes, but we would be applying the new standards even if portions of the road were built.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, Councilmember Herbie.
So when I was looking at the kind of specs for collector, you said that the design speed was 35 miles an hour?
Yeah, it's a recommended design speed. It doesn't necessarily have to be posted that way. It's more for controlling horizontal curvature and things like that.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I just, with our push for Target Zero and our push to want to, make sure that people can safely get around, I'm a little concerned with us designing things to a speed that we wouldn't. I mean, I can't imagine we'd be posting, on these residential streets that we'd be allowing or want people to be going a full 35 miles an hour. So I'm a little concerned with designing them for that, because as we know, people will drive how the roads are designed. And the other thing I was a little concerned about too was, and this kind of goes back to our conversation we had back in July a little bit about how much right-of-way we were going to take for all this. It has to do with the 10-foot lanes. I'm just a little concerned because 10 feet that's what we have on 522.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, that is the current lane width out there.
Okay, and I just looked up what a Hummer H2 is. It's about 6'8" wide with the mirrors out. And I was wondering if maybe we could, if there might be any drawbacks to maybe taking 2 feet off and making them 9 feet lanes to kind of slow people down a little bit. The Federal Highway Administration seems to think that that's an okay lane width for residential streets. It would also take away a little bit of the row that we're taking, that we're requiring for developers when they redevelop, and it would slow people down all at the same time. Are there any downsides to doing that, in your opinion?
Later in the presentation, before we ask for your opinion, we will go through the kind of right-of-way differences as well. About the smallest lane I think you can go to is about 8 feet.
I think we've only so far gone down to 10. I mean, I do think that's a policy conversation. I don't believe that there's as much of I'm not concerned about safety, but we do have to at some point talk about emergency response, getting vehicles through. They would provide a much wider roadway, so I don't think we're going to be able to provide as much as they'd like. So I think it's perfectly fine to have the conversation about a 9-foot width, and less impervious surface is better. So there's a lot of reasons why narrower lanes would be a good thing. I do think that I would talk about it as part of a whole. I might recommend we talk about it as a whole roadway width and cross section. So we kind of, in the context of, do you want amenity zones, sidewalk widths? Really, what are we trying to get at with the 9-foot lanes? If you have an amenity zone and a sidewalk, it may not be as important. So I might suggest we kind of
I'm
maybe
thinking
table
about,
that.
a kid whose ball bounces out in the street and somebody's doing 2 miles an hour slower because the road is slightly more constrained and they're able to stop in time. That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, we all know friction is good, whether it's narrower lanes and striping and cars parked on the side of the road. Those are all good things for slowing people down.
Chris did make a good point, though. Emergency access tends to like 20 feet. So if you were going to go to the 9-foot lanes, you probably would have to still leave some extra room, either by striping or as a parking area or as a bike lane, just for maintaining their clearance. So I don't think your roadway can shrink all the way to an 18-foot section, but you could potentially shrink your lanes to that still.
Okay, thank you.
Your next slide might actually be helpful on that.
Yeah, well, so this is showing the difference between the old standard, current standard is the old standard, and then as proposed. So currently, you see that we're increasing smaller roads by 2 feet. The middle section, we're actually keeping exactly the same. We're pretty significantly increasing that 50 to 100 range, but over 100, we're only over about 2 feet wider. So that's the net impact of the road widths. That doesn't include the amenity zones and the right-of-way stuff just yet, but that's just the pavement changes. So that kind of gives you an idea of why we think we should reduce it to 2 and what we think we can get away with. Let's keep going. So we jumped ahead a little bit, but we did want to mention that fire access does typically ask for 20 feet clear. Obviously, if we're going to allow on-street parking, it's not practical to maintain that 20 feet all the time because you'd have to have 20 feet plus the room for the parking. That's just tons of room. And like we mentioned, it's all over Seattle and stuff. So really, our proposed widths, we did want to point out, are not actually shrinking at all. We're keeping them either the same or larger at this point, at least as we've currently got them recommended. And then in my conversations with the fire marshal, their actual truck is about 9 feet, which is about the smallest you could go with lanes, I suppose, then. But again, they want the additional space more for getting their equipment in and out, the doors and stuff like that. So we're thinking, our logic is that there's brakes at every driveway, every fire hydrant. There's plenty of locations that they'll be able to pull up and get their stuff out. So we don't feel we're impacting it at all by allowing the parking within these sections. So this is our big list of all the potential impacts. As we talked about, we were going to provide the on-street parking because, well, we kind of feel that's the way the citizens have given us feedback through complaints and other things, and we know that when we've taken away parking, we've received plenty of complaints. So we feel this is important to the citizens possibly, but again, we also see the side where we're providing space for 4 cars on site. I did forget to mention when I mentioned that code section that while the code requires the space for the parking, it doesn't require that it continually be used as parking. So even if we require a 2-car garage on a single-family home, there's nothing that says it has to be used as a garage. They can fill that garage with boxes, they can convert it, they can do whatever. So there's no guarantee that that space is protected.
That was a good point.
Yeah.
And I'd like to emphasize that I actually was looking to see if I could find some, it'd be a great project for a graduate student to find out of the parking that exists across the country, how much of it is actually used for parking. Mine has a table saw in it, so there's no parking in my garage. So I can say that honestly. And I struggle with, I struggle with street parking and the real estate that we provide for it because we pay for it all. We pay for the asphalt. We pay for, it's a pollution generating impervious surface, so we have to pay for the stormwater to handle it. We have to maintain the stormwater systems. So, some neighborhoods really need the parking to function. There's other neighborhoods that if you had 2-stall garage and you could fit maybe even 4 vehicles on a driveway, would go a long way towards not necessarily needing street parking. So I think to me that's one of the larger policy questions, traffic calming aside, because I think we can do a lot with lane widths, amenity zones and sidewalks depending on the combination we choose, but providing parking is kind of we do it, but it's not without a price long-term as well. So if anybody knows of any
Yes.
data, let me know.
So Chris stole some of my thunder on
My
this, but yes,
soapbox.
that is some of the negative impacts. Is that we do have the additional maintenance of the asphalt that does fall to the city, and a majority of the time when we're dealing with water from the right of way, we're also maintaining the stormwater systems that are mitigating for that additional asphalt. So there's definitely some additional cost to providing that extra space for parking. If we shrink the roads just to the minimum needed for travel, we would potentially save some costs there. It's worth noting that the LID manuals are kind of recommending that you try to get residential roadways between 18 and 22 feet. That's their reduced width that they like to see for stormwater design. That is something that we're just starting to look into now is getting the finalization on that. If we go with the widths that are recommended in here at 24 and 34 feet, that's obviously quite larger. So as we develop the codes that are going to comply with the LID requirements, that's a section we will have to move beyond and do additional mitigation to correct or to bring in standard with the current LID practices. So.
Councilmember Herbig.
Is there maybe a happy medium where we allow for parking on one side of a street instead of both? Kind of reduce that width, reduce our liability long term. Is that a viable option?
Absolutely. We are looking for exactly that kind of direction from you guys today. So if that's what you think is that, so we've laid it out to function in a way where we think there's potential to allow parking on both sides. But if we have no interest in doing both sides and you think one side is more of a good balance, that's exactly the kind of direction we can go. We've been using 7 feet for the parking strip and maintaining at least the 10 feet clear for the lane. So within that guidance, we still could even tweak that. We could go with an 8-foot parking strip maybe, or tweak the lane widths to fit. But yes, we absolutely could do that.
But if we just got rid of parking on one side, we could essentially take off 7 feet.
Just chop off 7 feet, yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Yeah, to Councilmember Herbig's point, couldn't it make a huge difference on what the density is? Because if you're in one of our residential zones that has a much higher density, then probably that on-street parking is of higher value because they probably have fewer options off-street. Whereas if it's a lower density zoned area that's going to be developed up, wouldn't it play less of a role? Or am I not understanding something there?
Possibly, but all of the parking regulations are actually based on dwelling units, whether it's apartments or single-family homes or condos. So as your density goes up, so does your parking requirement. So that is kind of corrected for within the parking regulations. Now, obviously, the higher density, the more potential for guests and other things and parties and things like that would require street parking. So yes and no.
Yeah, it just seems like if the dwelling units are spread out further, you could probably get by with parking on one side a lot easier than you could if it was highly condensed in the project. That was the only point.
Yeah.
We hadn't gone back and taken that kind of approach. It hadn't been done before, and so I don't think we really considered doing that by zoning. That would be an interesting concept. We had not explored doing something like that where you'd be linked to your density, but if you feel that's the way we should go, we certainly could go back and take a look at that.
I'm not sure it's the way. I think that it does make sense that there's probably times where maybe we don't need parking on both sides for whatever reason. And, when I look at some of the list there, when it has, projects with 100 units, 50 units, we're getting to a point anyway where there's very few pieces of land left where you can have that type of density anyway.
Yeah, and probably the number of roads we have going in that will have 50 or more, that'll be newer roads or roads that are truly being improved to this level, is very limited. Most of them are probably going to fall in that 20, in the teens range for the number of houses they're serving.
Councilmember Curtis.
So I would be in favor of moving toward the parking on one side only, and partially because I lived in Wallingford. Okay, so those garages couldn't fit a Hummer in them. Okay, so we had one place for one car for our lot. That was it. So everything had to go out on the streets. So that's why you have to have parking on both sides. But with ours, requirement of 2 parking and then enough spot, kind of 2 people in front. So in theory, you could have 4. There's way less pressure than a Wallingford type of parking. So I'd be inclined to say, hey, if we've provided it on one side of the street and people are supposed to all be doing at least 2, I think we've done our duty. And I'd be inclined to keep the roadway smaller for lots of reasons.
Councilmember Sperry?
Well, thank you, Deputy Mayor. Well, as we were discussing this, Zach, I was thinking in terms of single-family neighborhoods, and so, I'm definitely leaning towards maybe one side of the street, that kind of thing, for parking. And then I'm wondering if maybe some of the density issues might be addressed when we look at the downtown roads, because we are kind of thinking in terms of multifamily and, much less street. Much less, there's not driveways, there are garages in some of the townhomes, but I don't think they use them for parking either. One thing, though, I do have a, sorry, it just kind of went away. I had my question and then I lost it. That's okay. I'll pass, and if it comes back to me, I'll ask it then. Sorry.
Okay. Councilmember Danuski.
Now, one thing I like about the option with parking on both sides is it doesn't necessarily have to be parking on both sides. It could end up, you have options. You could end up with a bike lane on one side and parking on one side, where if you don't build it wide to begin with, you've lost all your options there. So that's just something to consider.
One thought I had is in a very large development, over 50, maybe you're approaching 100 homes in this development. You've got an access road that comes into it, and then it branches off into smaller and smaller cul-de-sacs. It's like a tree, and the trunk of the tree needs to be wide, and the branches are smaller. Is there any provision in this for, the individual cul-de-sacs are 5 houses. Why would that cul-de-sac road have to be the big width?
It actually wouldn't, and we've had a handful that have developed that way. I think most people were not too familiar with that East Creek development and actually Bridle Path as well, that are ultimately going to connect through a third project. That'll become one loop road. And the loop road was designed to the wider standard, and then each cul-de-sac is its own. If it's a cul-de-sac that just serves 7 people, then that's what you calculate for that actual cul-de-sac.
It's not the whole development.
Right,
Has to be
right.
one
It's
way or the
just
other.
the feeder road that counts every single cul-de-sac.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other? Councilmember Sperry, remember
It came back. It came back. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the newer developments, how often the lot width is very, very narrow. And so you're going to have lots of driveways off of even the collector road, the main road. So how does that impact the availability of parking? Because clearly you're going to have, driveway.
Currently, I believe I can't remember if it's in the street standards section of KMC or not, or if it's in a separate section. We do have a requirement for 18 feet of separation between driveways. The theory being that can get a couple cars in there. So we do have that requirement in addition to the driveways having to be set back 5 feet from a property line, except at the very round part of the cul-de-sac where they're angled kind of. But so every driveway should at least be 10 feet, and actually by our regulations, 18 feet apart. So there is some room for vehicles in between these driveways.
How a normal driveway is about how wide?
Our driveways go 10 to 20 feet in residential areas, width.
So a minimum of 10 feet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you basically, at the most concentrated form, it would be like 18 feet in theory of parkable space, 10 feet break, 18 feet. So you could potentially, so it's not going to be a solid line of cars.
No. There are some exceptions to that when we get around that cul-de-sac bulb, just because they're all wedged in there. But on a straighter segment of road, that is the way it would be, yes.
Councilmember Herbig.
I just again want to restate that one of my concerns with widening the right-of-way overall is the long-term cost of us maintaining the asphalt. up front, the developer builds it, they dedicate it to us, it's free infrastructure for us. But long term, we're taking on the responsibility for, a century or more to keep that up. And we know how much, we spend $300,000-$400,000 a year on overlays and other things. And every square foot of asphalt that we take on that gets dedicated to the city is one more square foot of asphalt that we have to keep up for generations. So that's one of my kind of big concerns at this point, is just making sure that long term we can keep all of this up.
Any other questions? Now, what kind of direction do we need here?
Well, so
What are you asking?
I was actually going to jump into the amenity zone before we come back and like this, just because it's Councilmember
Okay.
Herberg suggested, it does impact the right-of-way as well. So we thought these kind of should all be looked at together so that you can see that holistic approach of what the ultimate end section is going to look like. So I'm kind of hearing at this point that most people think one is probably sufficient, but I think we'll be best to revisit it after this conversation, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So getting back into this amenity zone issue, if you guys remember from July, we kind of tabled this because there was conversation about how big is that right away getting, how much are we starting to take with these developments, and so we are currently recommending that we put the amenity zones on both sides of residential roadways, and currently they're not really prevalent in the standard at all. And so this is my nice picture that shows why we like these amenity zones so much. They separate the roadway from the walkway, so you've got a buffer for pedestrians, a lot more comfortable and safer for the pedestrians that way. The big one for me is that red one shown on your screen there, that level across the driveway, so we don't have to have driveway wings going up and down at every single crossing, and it just makes it a lot more pedestrian friendly as well as ADA friendly. And then along with that, we get that front space to put things like utilities. We can put fire hydrants, we can put street lights, we can put street signs, and that actually increases the visibility of street signs, because otherwise they have to be at the back of sidewalk, which can get obstructed and be hindered by vegetation. This keeps it in a much more visible area. And then the last thing is potential ability to do stormwater treatment. As we move towards the LID, we're really going to probably push these, what most people would refer to as rain gardens. The more technical term is a linear biofiltration swale, but these ones that just run along the road like that in that amenity strip where you've got a nice long area that treats, it doesn't have to be really wide to treat the width of the road, and that's all you're trying to do is just treat your stormwater right there. So these amenity zones really set us up to promote that even easier when we get to that LID step, so something to consider as well. So kind of ran through the good points of it, but we didn't get back into this that we did last time. That these are generally actually associated with potential home increase values as well, increases in home values as well. They just generally improve the aesthetics as well as the walkability of the neighborhood. There are additional landscaping needs, but that is currently assigned to the adjacent property owner in our code. And there's definitely additional development cost, and as we talked about last time, additional land that we need for the development. But now, we talked about we're already requiring or asking for it on both sides. So to take a look at the whole thing, we wanted to remind you all the different building blocks that are coming together in these roadway sections that we have. And this is not only the car lanes, but this is what we've decided on parking. This is also what we decide on these landscaping strips or amenity zones. We've had the conversation about sidewalks from the last review. We're going to put them on both sides. So, and then as well as your curb and gutter, which sounds silly, but again, with these LID designs coming down the line, they actually are, a lot of them are removing the curb and gutter, which saves you a whole foot or 2 feet by the time you get to the end of everything. So it actually can add up. And then we also talk about the less typical elements like bike lanes and potential medians or things like, or turn lanes, things like that. Those aren't as common in these residential roads, but all of the other ones are really, they come together for your final roadway section. And so with this is the full clip showing what, it's a lot of information, so you have to bear with me for a second. But you've already seen the first 2 columns there. That was from the road width discussion. And so that's just dealing with the pavement width. But what we did was take an additional look at the full right-of-way width in the next 5 columns. So currently, the first 2 roadway types, which would be folded into our single road type, are requiring a 40-foot right-of-way. And we would actually, if we did the full 24-foot lane, we did amenity zones on both sides, and we did sidewalk on both sides, we'd actually only be increasing the total land needed by 4 feet. So if we eliminated one of those parking lanes, we'd be back to below that number. We wouldn't actually be increasing. Or again, and so what I've shown there is if we just eliminated the amenity zones in that next column after as proposed, that's what we would reduce the right-of-way width down to, because we'd lose the 4 feet on both sides and we'd get a smaller right-of-way. And then the next column there is pretty much, I think, the smallest you can reduce your roadway widths to, which would be 20 feet. So if you went with a 20-foot pavement width, but you still wanted to keep the amenity zones and the sidewalks, we'd actually be at exactly the same right-of-way width as the current regulations. And then the last column there is just for the bigger roadways. If you wanted a 28-foot section for those larger roadways, that's what you would get as far as right-of-way. And again, it would be a reduction. So there's a lot of different tools. Like we said, we can talk with the sidewalk, we can talk with the amenity zone, the pavement width, the amount of parking we provide. All these can come together. And so you see kind of the holistic approach there of what the final outcome is to the developer's amount of land needed. So I'm hoping, seeing that we have enough to maybe get that input now, just knowing whether it's the amenity zones that trip it or the parking or that push that right away up. Hopefully now we can get some guidance.
Well, that's why we punted on the amenity zone in July, because there wasn't the context to understand if you are now adding, a total of 8 feet to your cross section, what does that do to your right-of-way needs? So, Zach, we looked at this upside down and sideways, trying to find a good way to show it, and I still find it confusing sometimes, but I think it is helpful to demonstrate that we have options and we really get to decide what we want to do. One thing Zach keeps mentioning, if I may, is LID. That stands for Low Impact Development. And we've talked several times about Richard is working with an internal city team, because by the end of 2016, we have to have more low impact development standards and look at our city policies. And we did say we're going to update our road standards now and then adopt them, because there's a reason road standards don't get updated very easily. It's because there's just a lot going on and things change. So we're doing our best to update the road standards now. And with Richard's LID work, that doesn't mean that next year we might not come, we might come back and propose tweaks to some of these things, but we just don't want to get too worried. We want to focus on LID if it's important, but we can come back and talk about low impact development later. I think some of the things Zach is talking about, we are taking into consideration already, but we might find we can do more.
Councilmember Herbig.
Well, as I said at the last meeting, I'm a huge fan of amenity zones, and I think they really do add a lot to the neighborhood and the general feel of the city. And I think if we trade off the one side of parking for the amenity zone, then we're really only adding an extra foot for the developer and for the right of way. And I think that's a good compromise. So that's where I'm leaning right now.
Councilmember Curtis.
Can you go back one slide? So looking at this makes me even more sure that I'd prefer all these parking on one side. So first of all, most of the developments are probably going to be in the 16 lots, more likely than the 100 lots.
Correct.
So when you look at that line, going from the current of 40 feet up to the as proposed 44, that's a 10% increase of taking property from the property owner. And I don't like taking property from property owners. So that's one thought. The other is, if our goal is to think more multimodal, well, let's get rid of more car space and give more walking and amenity space. So I'd rather slant the 40 feet in a way that's nicer for the neighborhood instead of making it particularly useful for cars.
Councilmember Sperry.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Councilmember Curtis, for asking me to go back to the slide, because that's where I was going. So on the second to last column, where it says 40 feet, and then it's got the the number one, going down to one side of the road, taking away the parking. So what else are we taking away to get this reduced pavement width? Is it just the parking on the one side?
Yeah, so in that column, it just assumed that the roadway width would be 20 feet. So in the smaller roadways, you're just taking away the 4 feet that you could spare until you got to the emergency access minimum. And then in the other one, you'd be taking away parking on both sides, but also be having a very restricted cross section. You wouldn't be able to have future turn lanes, bike lanes, that sort of thing. So if you did the 20 feet on the larger roadway type, you'd have a very narrow road with limited ability.
So I don't see it being realistic not having parking on either side of the street on the bigger one. So I'm on the very last one where it says 48 feet with the, again, it looks like parking on one side of the street. So I'm at the very last bottom far right. So can you explain what that would look like, the 48 there?
28 feet would allow you essentially one side parking and then two 10-foot clear lanes, which when you're getting into that 50 plus, I think we've kind of determined as staff that you probably want to maintain the 2 lanes at that point so that you're not having to dodge another car every 10 feet. So that is essentially if you got away with, if you reduce the larger roadway type to one side of parking.
So essentially, it's not changing the standard at all. It's just rearranging how we're using the land, if you will.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So that is equivalent to what the current standard is for anything over 50. It's just the 100-foot one. It would be less 100. So the very last column, you are reducing it slightly, but it's actually matching the current standard. Okay.
Yes, gotcha. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, in the 50 to 100, it's exactly the same width of pavement, but over the 100, it is reduced.
So based on that discussion, well, first of all, I love how your amenity zones did not have any trees in them, and I was wondering if you updated your slides after our windstorm, or was that?
Nope, same one. Same
okay,
one as before.
Well, it's fine if you did or fine if you didn't, but it actually helped me a lot because. To me, amenity zones meant, I'm thinking old Seattle neighborhoods with the giant trees and the buckling the sidewalks and the poorly maintained landscaping. I mean, that was kind of my negative image of it. But I'm kind of leaning more towards going with the amenity zones now, looking at the potential of using some of the bioswale technology for the lid and just giving some options there. And, and I liked how you're utilizing some of the space for signage and lighting and things like that. So I actually, appreciate all this work, and I'm leaning towards the one with parking on one side of the street. So the 40-foot for the smaller roads and the 48 for the other.
Councilmember Danuski.
I'm also leaning towards the amenity zones with some good guidance on what you can or shouldn't plant so we don't end up with buckled sidewalks like 61st.
Councilmember Curtis.
There's something I'm puzzled on. So looking at the 16 lots, so as proposed it's 44 feet. If the parking was 7 feet, how can you take 44, subtract 7, and end up with 40?
So the number there represents a 20-foot width. As we talked about that emergency access, so chopping off the 7 feet would be a little narrow. You'd be down to 17 feet in your total roadway width.
Can we go back to the picture that actually shows the cross section?
Yeah. This one?
Yes.
So if you chopped off one whole parking spot, you would be down to only 17 feet of pavement width there.
But that seems way better than 10 feet if you have parking on both sides. It's 7 feet better than 10.
Sorry, my 17 is the total paved width, so you would, if you had a car parked there, you would only have 10 feet of pavement left to work with.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But that is, again, below that 20-foot emergency access requirement. So
Got it.
in
Okay.
the graphic, I chopped it off at 20 feet being the minimum, basically.
I found the extra 3 feet. Thank you.
Could you explain a little more to me about the amenity zones as a stormwater swale And you partially explained it that it would affect the use of curbs and gutters. So would the road be up and the drainage go right into the parking strip?
Yes, and you can do that either in one of two ways. You can eliminate the curb altogether and just let it sheet flow straight off the edge into the swale, or you can do curb cuts, so you'd still have a curb and gutter that would be a good barrier, but every 50 feet, 100 feet or something, you'd have a cutout that would then drain into that swale.
And would you have gutters and drains along the side as well?
Typically you would. Most of the rain gardens have overflow storm drains, so they sit elevated so that the rain garden can fill up, but once you get to the point you're going to cause flooding somewhere, it would overtop into a storm
Do we have
drain.
any areas where we've done this in the city of Kenmore?
One is going in, I believe, but I don't think we have any finished at the moment, no.
Okay.
In my past life, we used them on the Aurora corridor, and so we were taking, high sediment, pollutant-laden water off the roadway, and we actually did scuppers in the curb, so we had a curb inlet, and then we actually had a sump where the water came in and kind of settled, and the fines came out, so we could just kind of vector out one location to get all the gunk. Then the water would flow into that 4-foot amenity zone. And as Zach said, we had a pipe that was perched pretty high as an overflow structure, so it had an under drain, so it was never going to flood the road again. But in all the years I kept an eye on those things after they were built, I never saw water go into the overflow. Even with not great infiltration rates, the water was still seeping into the ground. They were working great.
The studies with the salmon, any of that road, the road waste is very toxic to the salmon. And if it's filtered through soil and treated that way, it loses a lot of its toxicity. Mm-hmm. And so much better for the environment if we can do that. Mm-hmm. So.
And even if you have poor infiltration rates, as Chris hinted at, you bring in enough amended soils, that the topsoil that is free draining, and then you design it with an under drain. So even if you have crummy infiltration rates, you can still get the benefit of rain gardens in many places.
They have to be designed, though, because you can't get the water from almost any roadway uniformly to the curb. So their engineering does have to go into what's the topography of the road, where's the crown, what way is the water going to drain. What we were careful to do on the Aurora project is we actually have several that are rain gardens that work, and then we have some other amenity zones that look like rain gardens. So we were looking for a consistent, we wanted to look consistent, but depending where you were in the curb line, they behave differently. So I think we have good tools in the toolbox if we allow these.
Yeah. Aside from the environmental benefit of a rain garden amenity zone, it really improves the appearance of a neighborhood. And I think we're all in favor of stimulating that with our regulations. So, are there any other comments or questions from the council? Okay.
Thank you.
Do you have more in your presentation?
I do. Unfortunately, we still have two more to get through. I know.
Give you a recommendation yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think I'm good on those. Thank you very much. So the next one to talk about is what's called the half-street standard. This is used for roadways where they're developed. It's two developable properties, and maybe one side isn't part of the development, but one is. So we let them design a slightly lesser width in the temporary condition in order to push it up against the property line so that the next development will come in and hopefully use the same roadway they would build their half of the roadway with. This is currently allowed in the standards, and we're proposing not to change it. We just thought it was something worth revisiting. So I have some drawings that will hopefully help clear up what I'm talking about here. But so again, this is just a current one we're maintaining. So this represents, the image in front of you represents a parcel that was developed using this half-street standard. You can see that parcel A was part of the development. They built all their homes coming off this cul-de-sac, but they didn't finish the cul-de-sac on the other side. But when parcel B develops, they would be designing to come off of that same cul-de-sac and build their half of the roadway. So this the downside to these is typically that this is more of what you see then, and you don't know exactly how long this is going to last. This looks like a pretty unfinished road, and we have no control at that point whether parcel B develops, doesn't develop, does it in a year, does it in 10 years. So that's really the only downside, if I can be so bold. So it's just something worth considering if it's worth getting these temporary conditions in order to try and promote. The one of the advantages of them is they promote fewer cul-de-sacs. So rather than ending up with two parcels that each have their own cul-de-sac, we've got one shared cul-de-sac. So that's the advantage of it. And so this is essentially what the half street ends up looking like. In that example, parcel A would have been building the top image there. So they would build a 20-foot pavement width, which if we reduce our pavement width is going to be full roadway width anyways. But they would build the whole pavement width, and it would drain all to their side temporarily. And they would build their one side of amenity zone and one side of sidewalk and maintain a 5-foot setback at the property line. Then when the second parcel develops, they would go back and saw cut it at the center line, and they would develop the crown to come to their side, and they would build that whole half side over. They would remove and rebuild the portion that was on their half, and then they would add the portion that they need to widen, as well as their amenity zone and their sidewalk. And you can see that there's a shift in the amount of right-of-way, who's giving how much right-of-way. So the first person's giving, again, we're working with, something's off there. My numbers are wrong, but I've got another table that hopefully has it correct. But you can see that some of the right-of-ways, most of the right-of-way is going to come from parcel A, and parcel B is definitely going to get a break in the amount of land they have to give up in order to get that cul-de-sac in. So this is my actual table that shows the corrected numbers as far as who's giving which right-of-way. Again, lots of information there, but that explains in different conditions. So if we had them build only a 17-foot wide roadway as the temporary roadway, that's what A and B represent, both with and without the setback. And then C and D are the examples as shown with or without the setback. That can be eliminated. That's another portion of Kenmore code right now, is that all roadways are set back 5 feet, so that can be waived or adjusted for this application. Currently, we've been holding that 5 feet in the half street set standard. So, already mentioned that. Yeah, the advantage of this is that it comes up with less cul-de-sacs. It's about the most equitable sharing of the road construction costs as you can get, while still maintaining some level of service in your temporary condition. To build just purely half a roadway would not truly serve that temporary condition, so you can't just draw that line down the middle. It does essentially over mitigate stormwater because of the way that crown works out. The portion that ends up breaking and going back to the second project where they draw the crown line, that was actually probably mitigated in portion A and then re-mitigated again in parcel B. So you actually end up with a portion of the road that's double treated. And then you do end up with roadways, as I discussed, that never get fully improved. So that is the potential pitfall. And again, this level C is currently what we are proposing, so that is the correct numbers.
Councilmember Herbig?
So I'm not assuming that you're here when this happened, but what was the thought with having the 5-foot setback? Because that does seem to put a lot of extra building on the second party's plate.
In the cases where the example I showed was a vacant lot, obviously parcel B. Now there have been some instances where roads get built and there's a home on parcel B, and that home is only at the 5-foot setback from that property line, and so you would potentially be building the road 5 feet from the home, right on the property line. So at least with the 5-foot setback, you've gotten yourself the additional 5 feet. Now you've got 10 feet to the home. Okay. So I believe that was the logic behind it.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Good question.
So again, currently staff is recommending that we leave the standard as it is and maintain the 5-foot setback. We have other options if you would like to pursue them. This is showing one option in front of you where we would have them build potentially the full roadway and the curb on the far side, so there isn't going back and redoing the stormwater. There isn't, there's no need to cut back into it when the second parcel develops. They would pick it up from the back of curb and develop their stuff after the fact. The other thing you could apply, technically, would be to have them build the full roadway with their one curb and then leave the full right-of-way width next to the roadway. Again, that's putting all of the right-of-way ownership on one person, but it does technically give you the full roadway ability, even if the other parcel doesn't develop. Now, we could potentially go in and put in that amenity zone and that sidewalk within the property we have. And then the last option would be obviously just to have them build the full roadway. We can eliminate this half-street concept altogether. So those are all concepts that are on the table, and we are looking for your input.
I have a question.
Councilmember Smith?
Does it matter then for this guideline how many homes are served by that road? Because obviously in a cul-de-sac, you know, honestly, I could live with it that way for as long as parcel B decides they want to develop. But if it was on a road that seems like it received a fair amount of traffic, then it does seem like it's a little more of a little bigger issue.
Yeah, I see. I don't think currently we do. That would be very easy to add, that we would only apply these to that lower road type potentially. So I certainly could do that with the suggestion. As it is now, I don't believe that's in there, though.
Okay, thank you.
You have a question?
Councilmember Smith just asked my question. So.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Councilmember Curtis.
I'm inclined to leave it with your recommendation of don't change it.
Okay. So, just to kind of close the loop, so I hear that we like the half-street standard. Is it, but with the two feedback as far as, is there a limit? Do we only want to apply it to the smaller roadway types? Is that generally consensus, or do we just want to allow it on either roadway type?
I'm fine leaving it the way it is. I mean, it sounds like it's working. I don't know that it's a real issue.
I'm not sure how many of the bigger roadway types would really truly use this, but it is a discussion for for finalizing the standards at least. But
I guess you could have an entry road to a big development that's constrained, and if they could just build a half a roadway, it would be insufficient to feed the whole development. So maybe just the smaller developments, as you said, I think makes sense.
Okay. So I'm kind of telling that with three people, and is that good to run with it then?
Are we making this tough on you?
All right.
Private until it's full.
It's true with only 6 years.
I would have to double
It's just getting late. So what's
Sorry,
going to happen?
I couldn't really speak on that today. Yeah, sorry. All right, last one. Last one is just a matter of where do we want to apply these downtown frontage improvement standards. The frontage improvement standards, we talked in the first meeting, we talked about utility undergrounding, and we kind of felt that was a separate issue than this. These are talking about the special improvements that you see around here at City Hall and across the street going in. The 8-foot minimum sidewalk widths with the 2x2 scoring pattern, the street trees in the back of curb rather than in the median irregular strip. And then we also have a specialized street light style and a specialized pedestrian light style that we've been using down here. And so the way we have laid out the current or the proposed road standards is that these would be required in all of the downtown zones per the figure in 1852, and I have that, so I'll show you in a second. And so we're really looking for your guidance as to where you want those to begin and end. Currently we've left the electrical receptacles and the banner brackets specific to 68th and 181st, because those are the only place we've really planned on using those, to my knowledge. So I've left those off of this and separate. That could be added to this same conversation if you felt so inclined. So here's the current map that we're using, and so you'll see that if we used it as proposed, the standard would go from 61st all the way to 73rd along 181st, and it would also go up 68th and up 73rd. The area that is not in here that I think well, in my opinion, may most strongly want to consider is this lower point, the Lake Point site, and the lower half of 175th. I think that may potentially be areas you wanted this special treatment in. But that is what we're looking at now, and so we would love. Oh, I should talk about that. So there is definitely an increased cost for this. It is going to cost developers additional money to put the frontage improvements in. The street lights aren't the cheapest light type, and then the scoring pattern is a specific thing to pay for separate of your typical concrete. So, but it is important to get that uniform look through our downtown if that's the vision. So. Those are the potential impacts of it, and so we're ready for whatever recommendation you guys may have.
Councilmember Herbig?
Okay, so going back to the map really quickly, there's the one parcel, and I think it's the church over on 181st and just off 62nd probably. Looking at this map here, that would be that one parcel would be exempt from having to do those frontage properties improvements if it got redeveloped on 181st.
It's a good catch. No, I could certainly add that one in. That wouldn't make much sense. I agree.
Okay, because I would hate for, just because the address is on the other side of the street, I'd hate for something to happen there 50 years down the road.
Gotcha.
And not to have the improvements and to have this kind of weird feeling. Also, going to what you're talking about along 175th, I'm in favor of expanding the improvements along that area, because that is one area that I think we have a big potential for growth there, and I think there is something to be said for just uniform standards throughout the area. So,
Councilmember Sperry?
Thank you. A couple questions. The 8-foot sidewalks, is that what we have on 181st now?
Yes, I believe so. We have 10 foot up 68th, but it is 8 feet along 181st.
Is that the total right-of-way, or is that the actual sidewalk width?
That's the actual sidewalk width. Currently, the right-of-way may be at the back of the sidewalk, or it may be about a foot behind, I believe.
Okay. So I thought we had about that amount on 522. I'm just trying to get some perspective.
Yeah. The planter boxes are 4x4.
Okay.
The trees. Yeah.
So that 8-foot sidewalk, allows the
4 and then 4.
The front 4 feet to be the tree well, and then it goes from 4 feet at the skinny spot to 8 feet at the wide
Got
spot.
Where I'm struggling is I like the theory of, I'm all about how it looks, making uniform lighting, getting the sidewalks in and all that. And we've heard that over and over again that people really want that. Where I'm struggling is being so prescriptive, because my understanding is, like you kind of alluded to, that our particular light isn't the cheapest. I don't know if it's a custom fixture or something. And so I guess that's kind of where I'm, especially on the, I can see where, like, say, 181st, which is totally our main street, that I totally get that we want to have the same lighting, and then 522, we want to have the same one. But say an area like Lake Point or an area like the Plywood Supply, if it ever redeveloped, I would be fine if they had something that was similar, but not necessarily the same thing. I don't think you get to write that just like that in the code, but that's just kind of my thinking at this point.
So there is the process of, and I'm assuming Lake Point would likely go through this process, the development agreement process. So we could use going through that process, maybe one place to adjust that. I believe Rob suggested the idea of possibly doing districts. We weren't ready to do districts at this point, but I think his vision is, correct me if I'm wrong, please, more like Lake Point could have its own style, its own series of things, so that could stand alone as its own sort of district, so to speak. So that there is the ability to do that through a development agreement, or if that district concept is something that people are into, maybe even just one for north of 522, one for south of 522, that could be explored as well.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe those larger parcels might be better addressed through a development agreement, really look at it at that point, and maybe thinking of, the very prescriptive, this is our light, this is our sidewalk, this is our pavement scoring, could be more in, I guess for lack of a better term, on the north side of the highway in this area.
And neither
Councilmember
Zach,
Curtis. Whoops, go ahead.
so neither Zach nor I were here during the downtown, I don't think, standards, conversation about these things. So we're really wanting to do what you would like. So we'd love good direction on this one.
Yeah, and the current downtown plan is kind of very loose guidelines that say certain things that'll get you halfway there, but they don't have what, doing the development review, they didn't have what I thought was a good, clean, here's what you do, here's how you make it match the next person, here's how the next person's going to get the same application. So I very much wanted something that at least spelled it out what it was, but where to describe it would certainly be adjustable.
Okay.
Councilmember Curtis?
So even the brown zones, kind of that central zone, that one doesn't even have standards like what we're talking about now. They're looser. Is that what I just heard you say?
No, there are standards applied to those. All of these, each of these colors is a different downtown designation, and it has different, and it is more prescriptive, but each of those has a different set of prescriptive requirements. I could not, unfortunately, recite those for you at the moment.
Are any of them what we're proposing and talking about now?
Yes.
With the 2-foot squares and certain lights and all that?
That has been our interpretation of the current downtown code. But the current downtown code is very loosely worded. So we have made some implications of trying to get uniform looks and trying to encourage these things, but it is technically not spelled out currently.
Because I was part of the downtown task force at that time, and we made some major mistakes in suggesting that this could happen here and this could happen there on other people's private property, and that didn't go over really well. And even less than that. And so I think the downtown task force went the other way and said, well, we want a little bit of standards, but we really don't want to be too proscriptive. That got us burned. So I think that's probably why we ended up a little wishy-washy. So that's just my thought of how we ended up where we did. Because kind of 65th to 73rd on 181st, I see that's our intensely walking district. I really want to see total control over that area. How far it goes down 181st, I'm kind of flexible on that. I guess I don't see as much people get from that area to our downtown area, but I don't see that as where the intense walking, where it's all got to look the same as the brown area. And I definitely think the ones on the south side of 522, there's a huge highway dividing them. So visually, I have a gardening principle I call similar but different. And what it means is, like, I might want a tree that's similar volume and mass and size, but yet it has a different color or blooms at a different time. So to actually have things on the other side that's in a zone or whatever you called it, where it's clearly whoever does the cement plant area is Lake Point is going to have a similarity in their whole development, but I see no reason that it has to be the same as what we do on 181st. They're going to do some street lights. And to have a different flavor and a different type, I think would be more interesting, actually, because it's a different enough geographic area.
Okay.
So I would probably zone, the plywood plant area and the Lake Point, let them do their thing as long as it is consistent within those areas. And I would just like to see 181st, and I don't really care whatever the council wants as far as it goes. If it goes all the way down to 61st or if it cuts off at 65th, I'm pretty flexible on what that piece looks like. And like 182nd, I guess, I don't know, it's in the brown area. I'd probably keep all the brown area really consistent.
I'd like to interject on the lighting. Has there been any thought of requiring LED lighting? Because we turn it over to Puget Sound Energy, and then we pay the light bill after that.
Yeah, actually, the road standards will include that all new lighting should be LED.
Yeah, because the costs of it have come down dramatically since we spec'd it out on 522. What, as an aside, what are we doing in West A and B?
I'm pretty sure it's LED.
Huh?
I think it's LED.
LED.
Yeah.
Good. Because we turn it over to PSE, but then they bill us for the electricity that's used. So
correct. We pay for the lighting on the arterials. The smaller residential roads, when they require them, not all of them do. those are actually put to the HOA to pay for. So
What?
we only pay for the arterials.
Okay. Councilmember Sperry?
Does somebody else want to talk? Because I've already talked on this.
I've got something.
Huh?
Good.
I didn't see your hand, I'm sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
that's fine. I'll make a comment. So I would be for expanding it to the areas south of the highway, and one of the reasons is even, it's been brought up on the development agreement, but we should have a standard in place that's an expectation, because if they come to us with a development agreement, then that becomes a negotiating item that is, if we don't have a standard that's expected up front, then it's a give when we don't need to give, because they have to have a commensurate public benefit. And so I would say extend it, make it, it can be, let me go to the, there's 4 bullet points that you noted on there, and all of them are reasonable for the proposed standard. And it's saying 8-foot sidewalk, street trees at back of curb, specialized street light style, specialized pedestrian light style. I think those are very reasonable, and I think it's a fair enough expectation. And we know that development down there will have a development agreement. So if they want to change it, they can easily change it. They just have to present a reasonable argument. And as far as the map for how you have it designated now, I'd be generally for that. On the southern part, where 73rd comes down, I don't see, once you go too far east, it seems like it extends way down there east. I don't know if it has to be that far down, but I would be in favor of generally what you have there overall on that map, because it seems to make sense.
I should point out, I think I did this last time in the utility undergrounding. Obviously, the portion along 522, which is most of the green properties, is already getting done by us. So.
Any other questions?
No, it's, Councilmember Smith had a good point on the development agreement, that, having a standard is
Sure.
probably a good idea.
Councilmember Sperry, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm still staring at the brown now that was pointed out. There's a couple of parcels on the south side that are also brown. Is that downtown commercial? That's what the brown is? I kind of forgot. Anyway, it's okay. Don't worry about it.
Sorry. I was digging into this in July, so I actually can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize.
Well, one of them actually, it looks like it was a super supplements parcel, and that I think was, recently developed, and it was with the new standards, and that looks great, actually.
Yeah, we actually built that most of that sidewalk with the 522 project, but
so that's why it looks great, because we built the sidewalk.
They did bring it around the corner on 175th a little bit.
Okay. Well, I think extending the prescriptive, the standards that we require in the brown section would help with that distinctiveness. And to Councilmember Smith's point about you can always ask and then negotiate later. I mean, that is a good way to do it, probably from a negotiating term. So I don't really have any problem with having those 4 points. Again, I just would like them to have the freedom of having their own specialized street light or something like that, not necessarily you buy this model.
So I heard you say that within the red outlines, we should also include the requirement, even though there may be a development agreement in the future. So do these areas look right?
I have a question on that. So if we had a development standard, and we said those 4 elements have to be there, they could say, yeah, but could we substitute a cheaper one, and that could be part of the discussion. It's not a question of will we have lights that are specialized and unique, but could they maybe find an alternative to save themselves money?
Yeah, we'd have to determine it an approved equal, so we would still have some control over it, at least looking aesthetically good. But yes, there would be the possibility of doing that as more of a administrative thing.
That's fine.
Any other questions?
Areas look fine to me.
Okay.
I think. So I'm thinking that. Let me sum what I'm kind of thinking from what I think I heard. So with the brown areas, I think it sounds like we're pretty good with a very clear, precise definition, and then in the red areas and the areas below, a much kind of looser, more prescriptive version that it will get us to the table, but something we can figure out as we work through the actual review. Is that kind of?
I think I'm puzzled. The word brown area, I meant brown, but I see reddish and green areas. Is the rest of the council thinking the reddish and green areas would also have these standards, or just the brown?
I was thinking just the brown is what I was
Okay.
thinking, but I don't know. I'm just speaking for me. And
Yeah, that's what I was meaning brown.
and
And I just wanted to make sure we didn't mean the whole.
Well, I was thinking people were talking the whole thing.
Yeah, I thought
I
were
thought we
talking
already
about
had
the whole thing.
requirements on the brown area, and we were talking about expanding it to the red area, correct?
Well, that's
Good
part of the
question.
conversation. Either way, I am suggesting that we go with much more exact standards in the brown area, but yes, they are already applied in the brown area. There's actually some degree of standards already applied to the red areas as well. But
I mean,
I
the
unfortunately
outline,
cannot.
the outlined red area.
No,
Okay.
the actual shaded red, these
So-
reds.
So we have requirements in all of the shaded areas here of some sort,
Correct.
and the discussion is about expanding it south of 175th. Because it seems like
prescriptiveness.
Yeah, so in the brown areas we've applied a very specific standard, and so we're formalizing that, and then I'm asking if you want me to extend that specific standard out to the other areas. We can still leave the prescriptive version that's in the downtown code currently.
But it sounds like that isn't even as prescriptive as we're talking about. The 4 specific elements with the squares and all aren't in even the brown zone right now. There are lots of rules, but not quite this prescriptive.
There are rules. It doesn't exactly get into that kind of scoring and that kind of stuff. So, but yes, it does talk about the 8-foot sidewalks and the trees at the back of walkway and extra pedestrian lighting as well. But the specifics are not in there, no.
Could you put the slide back up with the red areas? Because the entirety of those red areas are not areas, I mean, the whole area doesn't have to have a development agreement. I mean, you're looking at plywood supply, which is a portion of the red area east of 68th, and Lake Point is just a portion of the other area. Is it possible then, I mean, if we rely on a development agreement and a master plan and so on to be able to negotiate this, there are areas there that won't necessarily do it, and they'd be going by these minimum standards that we might be prescribing.
So the way I would envision this working out is that we would in the encircled red areas, not the shaded red areas, we would have, or actually in the other red areas as well, we would leave the prescriptive description. So it would say that something is required there, and then at that point we would go through that process during the actual review, and it's more of a case-by-case basis that way.
Mm-hmm.
Then if we had one large project go in, say a Lake Point size project that used one, we could then actually push that through and say this is the new standard based on meeting the prescriptive standard. So we can kind of update as we go. Was kind of how I would see that playing out.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Urbig.
Okay, I appreciate the clarification there. I got a little mixed up. Personally, I'd like to see a stronger, more unified standard, at least down 181st. And then I'm open to other things with the rest of it, but I think 181st is going to be kind of our main street in a generation, and I think we should have kind of a more unified feel to that street at a minimum.
All the way down to 61st.
Yeah, I mean, we're planning here for the next generation. It's going to take a while for it to develop, but at some point it will. And and I think we should have a unified feel to the whole stretch.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, now we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm not sure what our recommendation is to you. Could you summarize what you think we want?
It sounds to me like there's still some debate about if we're going from 61st to 65th along 181st. I think everything else is clear to me. It's just a matter of if there's a need to extend it to 61st, or if we should stop it at 65th, which is where the colors change on you there. So that's the only question I have.
In the near future, I don't know that we need to be thinking about west of 65th. But maybe a generation from now, maybe so. But there were more things. This is your policy number 8. There were a number of things that we've talked about tonight, and I want the council to know what it is you think we want.
Okay.
Could you summarize all the things
Gotcha.
that you have got?
Yes. So on the roadway widths, the direction was to settle for parking on one side and set the roadway widths accordingly. And I heard with that correction that the amenity zones on both sides is recommended.
Okay.
And then, let's see, policy 7. I didn't hear any objections to the half-street standard. Sounds like we're going to keep the setback as well. And then we are going to apply the stringent standards to the Brown area with some still confusion about whether to go to 61st or not, and then leave the prescriptive descriptions on the other areas in this map, including 175th.
Okay. Is everybody okay with that?
I have a comment on the 61st through the 65th. So that there's only X amount of spot there now that you can put road, sidewalks, amenities. Okay, so if you've gotten now, you've said you're going to put 8 feet with the trees at the back on each side of that road, you've taken a huge chunk of that 181st between 61st and 65th. If I'm hearing, if we extended these Brown standards all the way down to 181st.
Do we have the right of way to do that?
No. Well, this again would be with development. If we didn't have the right of way for a capital project, we would have to either purchase it or adjust the project accordingly. But this would be in a development where they would be giving us the right of way as part of that development.
It seems like if we wanted to go that way, we'd be giving up parking. I don't see how we could have 8 foot, basically 8-foot sidewalks and any parking and any road left over. So I feel more strongly that we shouldn't go all the way down to 61st with that sort of a standard, 8 foot wide on each side of the street with trees at the back.
Mrs. Overlease?
Yeah, the challenge with the west of 65th is topography.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's not so much up and down the road as it is down on the south side and then up to the north side. So I think there's probably a lot more right-of-way out there than you realize, but the way driveways are built and how steeply it drops off, you really kind of have a narrower table in which to build on. So something to think about. It's not as much right-of-way width as just reality of how homes and apartments have been built over time. And a lot of those driveways, too, those, especially on the south side, there's a lot of grade being made up in the right-of-way for those homes. And to widen out and build sidewalk, we're just really not pressed for right-of-way per se, but real estate on which to build sidewalk.
You got retaining walls and
it's going to be horribly expensive to build sidewalk west of 65th. Not in all areas, but in some of them. That might be an area where you have one, really good sidewalk on one side first.
Because there's some kind of standard there that at least adds more than we have now.
Correct. I unfortunately cannot tell you what it is off my head today. I apologize.
I remember there was a lot of discussion on every single one of those zones as we kept adding and saying, okay, the downtown, we want a certain look, and then we're more flexible as we went out on both ends of that.
Councilmember Sperry.
So I would recommend that we keep the prescriptive downtown street standards to that Brown area because in light of the topography change on 181st there.
That does seem to be the somewhat consensus I'm hearing. So is that okay if I proceed with that?
Yeah, as Zach has outlined, summarized everything, are we okay with that? Yeah, Councilmember Smith.
I think I am, and the reason is because of the topography, because I am concerned about, well, I really would like to see it extended to 61st, but I do think there are some significant costs associated with just even going another foot in a sidewalk could create a significant retaining wall expense, and as well as the loss of what is potentially part of the level land of that site. So I can live with the 65th right now, but gosh, that's a tough one. It really is.
Chris?
We'll be coming back with this document in its entirety next. I might suggest that Zach and I do a little more research, because we did just update the transportation element of the comp plan, and as Zach reminded me, it probably would be good to revisit what we said we were going to do out there streetwise. So maybe we can do a little more research on 181st west of 65th, and when we bring the whole document back to you, we can talk about it again.
Okay.
Sounds good.
I think that'd be good.
Yeah.
Well,
Anything
that was
else
it for
you
me.
need?
No, thank you very much for your time.
And thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for
Thank you.
an excellent explanation of it all.
Yeah,
Heavy stuff.
I kept thinking.
Okay, staff report.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few things. Last week we had a tragic accident where there's a bicycle fatality, cement truck versus bicyclist. Pretty tough week for all of us last week in hearing the news and reacting to it. The traffic investigation is still going on. It's going to take some time for it to become final. I don't have a good ETA on when it will become final. But we're trying to learn all we can from it. Our traffic engineer is plugged into it and wants to really learn from this as much as he can, and looking at different things to potentially avoid it in the future, if anything. So stay tuned on that. The Neighborhood Transportation Plan program has been launched. The first meeting is with the Arrowhead neighborhood tomorrow night here at City Hall. And then the second meeting is with the neighborhood that's at the southeast corner of the city on Thursday night. And then there's 2 or 3 more planned for subsequent weeks. And I can email you those exact dates. There's about 14 neighborhoods in all, and about 5 of those have been scheduled.
How are residents getting notified?
They're getting a mailer, a direct mailer in the mail. Yeah. Imagine Kenmore has also been launched, so we have the online tools for people to give their input. Also, the night of the 22nd, there will be a big meeting here, and hopefully get some good turnout and get some good input from citizens. We are encouraging people to give their input through the survey or through the online map. We've already gotten some good comments from citizens on that, so it seems to be going well. On Sunday, there was a power outage in the northwest corner of the city. About 1,500 residents were affected. And it had to do with the insulators on a particular line that was coming out of or near the substation. That's the word. Thank you. At 185th near 67th. And
it's right up here.
Yeah, right here. Yeah. So as the power line is approaching the pole, you need these insulator discs to dissipate the heat so that it doesn't heat up the pole. And the line had detached from those insulators and caused the breaker to trip. They went out first time, couldn't figure out what was wrong, so they switched the breaker back on. Everybody had their power on for about 15 minutes, and then it popped again, and so then they had to do more investigation on it. There were some cars in the way of the telephone pole, so it took time for them to find the car owners and get them to move their cars. And anyway, long story short, or I guess the point of this is, my sense, it's anecdotal, but my sense is the folks, especially in that part of the city, seem a little more picked on when it comes to power outage frequency, and also just being the last ones to get their power turned on when there's a kind of a regional power outage. Nancy Owsley did great today. She tracked down kind of a higher up at PSE, and we explained the situation, and we got a kind of a explanation of what happened in writing. We asked specifically, why are we the last ones to get our power turned on when there's a regional outage? And they said they take the hub approach, where they work on power around the hub, which is, I guess, in Redmond, and then they work their way out, and we happen to be on the outer edge of the system. Lake Forest Park is served by Seattle City Light, so we are the very last outer edge of their system. And it makes sense that you would start with the hub lines and you work your way out. But we asked, well, is it aging infrastructure? Why do we have so much frequency up here? And he wasn't able to answer that question. But Nancy was able to get them to start arranging a meeting where we actually meet with some of their higher level engineers to talk about what's going on here in Kenmore and why do we have so many frequent outages. And coincidentally, our franchise agreement with them is up this year. So it's a good time to be negotiating our franchise agreement right now. So we are working on it. I forwarded you a letter from a resident named Russ Johnson. He's lived here for many, many years, and he's frustrated, and he shares this sentiment about his part of the city in the northwest quadrant being extra vulnerable and everything I just described. So we'll work with him and make sure his voice gets heard loud and clear, and any other citizens that want to weigh in on this.
Just to comment on that, 196th, a lot of those folks on the north side, they have sewers that pump up. And so that's why they may complain more. When the power's out for 2 days and you have 5 kids in a house, it's a problem.
Right.
Question. Franchise agreement is up for renewal. What are the possibilities of negotiating with Snohomish PUD?
Well, that's a tough question I can't answer off the cuff.
We're in the PSE area. We're not in Snohomish County, but just a few blocks north. They didn't have a power problem.
Yeah. You're talking about ownership of equipment and all that. And so,
I don't know.
Yeah, interesting question, though. And lastly, Mrs. Michelle Murphy was here at the beginning of the meeting talking about pickleball noise. Wants a change in the ordinance so that pickleball isn't allowed in residential areas. I guess I'd just like to know your initial reaction to that. Usually when code changes come up or requests for code changes come up, we typically take those to the retreat and we give you a list of code changes and which ones you want to do and which ones you don't, and the ones you do want to do, we just plug them in for the year. I'm suspecting she probably wants action more quickly than that. There's also, you may think it might be just easy to just plug the word pickleball into the code and be done with it, and it's a quick change, and maybe it is. But Councilmember Herbig kindly just forwarded me a blog about cities that regulate pickleball noise, and there's this one city that actually has zones, and they prescribe different types of pickleball paddles for what zone you're in, and so it actually can get complicated. So, I don't know, I'm rambling on, but what are your thoughts? Do you want us to pursue this? Do you want us to wait?
I'll tell you my thought is I just feel like it's just like a basketball court. I mean, once you start down that path, you could have so many athletic activities that would fall into a noise category. And how many driveways have a basketball hoop in them? And I just feel like to just pick on pickleball
And tennis is noisy.
doesn't.
Too.
Yeah, So anyway, I'm generally not in favor of changing the code.
Councilmember Danuski.
Yeah, it's certainly not fun if we start regulating outside noises. I can understand how hours and hours of pickleball noise every single day would be really annoying, but like we play pickleball on our sport court for a little while a day. I'd like to be able to continue to do that. So I don't know. I think there'd be a whole bunch of unintended consequences if we just said, no, you can't play pickleball. So.
Councilmember Sperry.
Thank you. Well, I always like to start by asking, how big of a problem is this? And, we really have had this one complaint. And is this a big problem, or is there another way to solve this problem?
And Brian, are we getting any other complaints? Okay.
The other thing is that I always think it's best to try to solve things at a neighborhood level versus making rules for everybody. For example, I have a neighbor that right behind my fence has a basketball court. And, sometimes they play basketball when I'd rather they not play basketball. But, I live with it. It's no big deal. I have another neighbor that, now this has not happened recently, but they have a tennis court. It's actually about halfway down the street. And every once in a while, they'd have a party and they'd play pickleball. And I'd hear them playing pickleball. Well, I never went crazy about it. It's not day after day, night after night and stuff like that. The noise does carry. So I guess what I'm thinking is, before we spend a lot of time and try to figure out how to regulate this, is yes, there's sort of a good neighbor aspect to it. And I don't know to what level, if any, the city could recommend maybe some mediation. I don't know what, if there's a compromise that these neighbors could do it. So basically, my question is, how big of a problem is it? And we've basically had one complaint. Now, the person has been very persistent. I have no doubt that it's, disruptive to that person. And I can understand if it's, things are irritating and you focus on them, they become more irritating. And, it can get kind of not very nice. But anyway, to me, I don't feel the need to go into a lot of regulations on this. I would love to see them try to work something out. So.
Yeah, it's really a slippery slope. I've got a neighbor that's got a beagle that barks constantly when it's outside. Where do you stop?
Well, there are laws against that.
Oh, there are?
Barking dogs, yeah.
Barking dogs?
You bet, yeah.
Oh, yeah? Oh. Okay. So much for that. Councilmember Curtis?
So I know Dennis Trout had a pickleball court, and I don't remember the noise ever being excessive. So that's the first thing. I didn't really even notice his pickleball court being bad. And the other thing, I think in this one, there was a question in my mind of, is the court on a driveway?
Yeah, that was kind of...
And can we regulate use of driveways for pickleball courts? So it just seemed weird that a pickleball court would be on a driveway. So I'm not in favor of regulating pickleball courts, except if the noise is above whatever decibel we set. But it just seemed weird to put a court on a driveway.
And the noise ordinance
would there be a
too.
place to regulate that instead of regulating the sport itself? I just don't know.
This particular court is on a shared driveway, so there's a driveway that 2 or 3 houses share, so it's actually similar to a road. It's paved asphalt.
Is it private?
Private.
It's a private road. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know.
I think the argument is that pickleball noise in particular is kind of unique. It has an extra
Ping to it.
yeah, like an extra. What did you say? Pop
or ping.
Ping. Yeah. Something that's extra annoying, a little more piercing to the ear, more so than, say, tennis or basketball or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
You could buy her a case of those pink earplugs.
I was going to say, yeah, there's lots of other ways to deal with this rather than...
Yeah,
Give her an iPod with earphones and let her listen to music while they're playing their sport, or somebody's got to.
I like Councilmember Sperry's idea about mediation. King County District Court offers that service for free.
Yeah, I think
And they've got good mediators.
come up with an agreement that works for them.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That's all.
That's all? Okay. Council member comments? Councilmember Smith?
Nothing to add, thank you.
Sperry?
Thank you. West Sammamish Bridge, I guess we're looking at arranging a 3-hour tour, which I always think of Gilligan's Island every time I see that email, to look at potential art for the bridge. And I came across an article about a new bridge in Portland. It's a footbridge that just opened up, and I actually looked up the name of it. It's Tillicum, but it's Tillikum.
Tillicum,
yeah. Am I saying that right? Tillicum? Anyway, it's pedestrian. It's a pedestrian bike bridge only. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up is what they did for their lighting, or for their, I'm assuming, art, is they did 178 LEDs, and the colors and the motions change based on the speed and the height and the water temperature of the river. And I thought, well, that might be cool. And then my husband did point out the slough doesn't go very fast, so it may not be that exciting. But I thought it was kind of an interesting aspect of having some kind of lighting that is actually responding and changing based on the conditions of the Sammamish River. So I thought it was kind of cool. So I haven't seen any pictures, so if you get a chance, if you're interested, check it out.
Councilmember Curtis?
Nothing really to add, except it's just fun and exciting to be back here with all of you.
Yeah. Well, Councilmember Herbie?
Nothing to add.
Councilmember Daniski?
In the old news, but we haven't been here for a while. Thank you, everybody, who helped on Play Day, and we had at least 600 people show up this year. It was a good event, so thanks.
Okay, and I don't know whether you noticed, the boy sitting out there was Luke Danuski, coming down here to see what his mom was doing.
He missed me today, so he came down to watch me.
And it was welcome to be here. Again, the October 9th is when this Advanced Transportation Technology Conference is scheduled, and all three of the sub-area boards are sponsoring it financially, along with PSRC and several corporate sponsors as well. There are a number of us that have registered for it, Councilmember Danuski, myself, Ms. Overlease, I don't know who else, anybody else on the council. If it's at all possible for you to go to this, it will be an interesting event, and it's really worthwhile attending. And if you want to go, check in with Nancy Meehan. She's making the arrangements for everybody. The other thing that I just saw in the email today was MRSC is sponsoring the Future of Government Conference, which is a few days earlier than that, October 6th, down at UW Hub. And the speaker is Rebecca Ryan. Have any of you ever heard Rebecca Ryan? She's a futurist and really a dynamic speaker, and really fun to listen to. And I bet you that you'll go to that conference and you'll come away with some interesting ideas of what the future of government might be. So that's at the Hub on, check your email, on October 6th. Student Union Building at the University. And it's co-sponsored by MRSC and University Evans School of Public Affairs. So, other than that, I have nothing else. So, at this point, we will recess this meeting into executive session. The executive session is expected to last approximately 15 minutes, and no action is expected when we return. Did you want to say something?
Potential litigation.
Sure. Let's take a 5-minute break. Good idea.
Deputy Mayor, could you announce that it is for potential litigation?
Pardon me?
Could you please announce that it's for potential litigation? I don't think I heard that.
No,
mentioned.
I didn't say that. Yeah,
Did you say that?
Okay. It wasn't on my script. Potential litigation wasn't in my script.